They say the coldest hearts are forged in the hottest fires. But what happens when a man deliberately walks into the flames and refuses to burn? Grand Duke Lucien Valmont had spent a decade proving he could survive anything: betrayal, war, political annihilation, without flinching. Yet on the morning of his arranged wedding, standing alone in a cathedral built to hold 1,000 witnesses, he looked less like a groom and more like a man preparing for his own execution. What he didn't know was that the woman walking toward him in borrowed silk and a veil of lies would be the only enemy he'd never see coming. Stay with me, because what unfolds here isn't just a story about deception. It's about what happens when two people built to survive alone discover they might actually need each other to live. Despised. The carriage rattled over cobblestones that had witnessed 3 centuries of imperial processions, but Evelyn Hartwell heard none of it. Her hands were clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had gone white beneath the lace gloves, and her breathing came in shallow pulls that fogged the window glass. Outside, the capital city of Aranthia sprawled in early autumn glory, market stalls bright with harvest produce, children chasing geese through fountain squares, banners snapping in the wind above guild halls. It was beautiful. It was utterly irrelevant. She was going to marry a man who would destroy her family if he learned the truth. The dress she wore had been fitted for her sister Clarissa 3 weeks ago. The seamstress had taken in the waist and let out the bust with hurried stitches that Evelyn could feel pulling against her ribs every time she breathed. The veil that covered her face was Alençon lace, worth more than everything her family had left after the scandal. And the ring waiting for her at the cathedral, a Valmont heirloom that had adorned the fingers of duchesses for 200 years, would be slipped onto the hand of an impostor. Evelyn closed her eyes and tried to summon some fragment of the courage her sister had always possessed so effortlessly. Clarissa would have laughed at this situation, would have turned it into an adventure, would have walked into Lucien Valmont's fortress with her head high and her wit sharper than any blade. But Clarissa wasn't here. Clarissa had vanished 4 days ago, leaving behind only a note that said, "I'm sorry," and a family teetering on the edge of complete ruin. The carriage lurched to a halt. Evelyn's eyes snapped open. Through the window, she saw the Cathedral of St. Theodora rising like a mountain of white marble and stained glass, its spires piercing a sky gone gray with approaching storms. Crowds pressed against the iron barriers, held back by imperial guards in crimson and gold. Nobility in their finest silks clustered on the cathedral steps, their faces bright with the cruel anticipation of spectators at a gladiatorial match. They were here to see if the Grand Duke's new bride would survive the ceremony. The carriage door opened. A white-gloved hand appeared, palm up, waiting. Evelyn stared at it for 3 full heartbeats before she remembered she was supposed to take it. Her fingers trembled as she placed them against the stranger's palm, and then she was stepping down onto stone that felt as cold as a grave even through her silk slippers. The crowd noise hit her like a physical force. Shouts, whispers, the rustle of 1,000 bodies pressing forward for a better view. Evelyn kept her chin level and her eyes forward, the way her mother had taught her when she was 12, and still foolish enough to believe that good posture could protect you from the world's cruelty. She moved toward the cathedral entrance where her father waited, looking smaller and grayer than she'd ever seen him. Lord Edmund Hartwell had been a handsome man once. The portraits in their manor house showed a figure of aristocratic bearing, with kind eyes and a scholar's gentle hands. But the gambling debts and the scandal and the months of watching his family's name dragged through every drawing room in the empire had hollowed him out. Now he looked at his younger daughter with something too complicated to be called gratitude. "You're saving us," his eyes said. "You're the sacrifice we needed." He offered his arm. Evelyn took it. Together they climbed the cathedral steps while the crowd roared and the nobility whispered, and somewhere far above them church bells began their mournful toll. The massive bronze doors stood open, revealing an interior vast enough to swallow sound. Rows of pews stretched toward an altar, blazing with candles, and between them ran a silk runner the color of old blood. At the far end, barely visible in the golden haze of candlelight, a figure stood waiting. Evelyn's breath caught. She had seen portraits of Grand Duke Lucien Valmont. Every noble household in the empire kept at least one, usually displayed prominently as a reminder of who truly held power beneath the emperor's distant throne. The painting showed a man of severe beauty, sharp cheekbones, pale eyes, hair as black as winter nights. They showed the uniform of the imperial military, decorated with medals earned in the northern wars. They showed everything except the truth. The man waiting at the altar looked like something carved from ice and rage. He stood perfectly still, hands clasped behind his back, shoulders rigid beneath a coat of midnight blue velvet that had probably cost more than Evelyn's entire dowry. His face was angular and bloodless, lit from below by candelabra flames that turned his eyes into chips of Arctic gray. He wasn't handsome. Handsome was too soft a word for features that sharp, that merciless. He was arresting. He was terrifying. And he was looking at her like she was a problem that needed solving. The music began. Some massive organ piece that shook the cathedral's foundations, all thundering bass notes and triumphant brass. Evelyn's father squeezed her arm once, a gesture that might have meant comfort or warning, and then they were moving down the aisle. Each step felt like walking deeper into freezing water. The nobility turned to watch her pass, their faces a blur of jewels and judgment, but Evelyn barely saw them. Her entire focus had narrowed to the man at the altar, to the way he watched her approach, with the cold patience of a predator. 20 pews. 15. 10. She could see details now. The sharp line of his jaw. The way his coat sat perfectly across shoulders that looked strong enough to carry the entire weight of the empire. The absolute absence of anything resembling welcome in his expression. This was a man who had been forced into this marriage by political necessity, and he had decided to endure it the way he endured everything else, with controlled brutality and zero sentiment. 5 pews. 3. Evelyn's father released her arm. She felt his absence like the loss of a shield, however flimsy it had been. 2 more steps, and she stood before Lucien Valmont, close enough that she could smell the faint scent of bergamot, and something darker, like smoke from distant battlefields. Up close, he was even more overwhelming, taller than she'd expected, radiating a presence that made the cathedral feel suddenly smaller. He looked down at her through the veil, and his expression didn't change by a single degree. The Archbishop of Aranthia cleared his throat. He was ancient, robed in gold-threaded white, holding a leather-bound prayer book that had witnessed 100 royal weddings. When he spoke, his voice echoed through the cathedral like the pronouncement of judgment. "We are gathered here in the sight of the Emperor and the eternal powers to witness the union of Grand Duke Lucien Valmont and Lady Clarissa Hartwell." Evelyn felt the words like a blade between her ribs. Clarissa. They were marrying him to Clarissa, to the sister who wasn't here, to the woman whose name Evelyn would have to answer to for the rest of her life. She forced herself to breathe slowly, to keep her hands steady, to maintain the fiction that was all that stood between her family and complete destruction. The Archbishop droned through the ceremonial words. Treaties and alliances, the joining of noble houses, the continuation of the empire's strength through marriage. It was all politics dressed up in religious language, and everyone in the cathedral knew it. This wasn't a union of hearts. This was a business transaction between 2 families that despised each other, brokered by an emperor who needed Lucien Valmont's military support more than he needed anything resembling actual affection. The Archbishop paused. He looked at Lucien with something approaching pity. "Grand Duke, do you take this woman as your lawfully wedded wife, to honor and protect according to the laws of the empire?" Silence stretched across the cathedral like a held breath. Evelyn watched Lucien's face and saw absolutely nothing, no emotion, no hesitation, no sign that he considered this anything more significant than signing a military contract. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and precise, with the faint rasp of someone who didn't waste words on unnecessary speech. "I do." 2 words. Flat as gravestones. They echoed through the cathedral and seemed to seal something far more final than marriage vows. The Archbishop turned to Evelyn. "Lady Clarissa, do you take this man as your lawfully wedded husband to honor and obey according to the laws of the empire?" This was it. The moment of absolute commitment. If Evelyn said these words, there would be no going back. She would be bound to this terrifying stranger by laws that even the emperor couldn't easily break. She would enter his fortress and live under his authority and sleep in rooms that had witnessed the slow destruction of every other woman foolish enough to marry into the Valmont line. But if she refused, her father would be arrested before sunset. Her family's remaining properties would be seized. Her younger brother would grow up with a name so tainted that no respectable house would ever acknowledge him. Evelyn lifted her chin and met Lucien's eyes through the veil. "I do." Her voice came out stronger than she'd expected. Clear enough to carry through the cathedral, steady enough that it almost sounded like she meant it. She saw something flicker across Lucien's expression. Surprise, maybe, or curiosity. But it vanished so quickly she might have imagined it. The archbishop raised his hands. By the authority vested in me by his imperial majesty and the eternal powers, I pronounce you husband and wife. May your union strengthen the empire and bring honor to both your houses. He nodded at Lucien. You may kiss your bride. Evelyn's heart stopped. She hadn't thought about this part. Hadn't prepared for the moment when the veil would be lifted and Lucien would see her face clearly for the first time. Would he recognize immediately that she wasn't Clarissa? Her sister was taller, more striking, with a confidence that showed in every feature. Evelyn had always been the overlooked one, the quieter one, the daughter their father could barely remember existed half the time. Lucien reached for the veil. His fingers were steady, almost clinical in their precision. He lifted the lace slowly, revealing her face inch by careful inch, chin, lips, nose, eyes. The candlelight caught her features and she knew exactly what he was seeing. A woman too pale, too thin, with dark circles under her eyes from 4 days of sleepless terror. Not a bride. A ghost in borrowed finery. Their eyes met. For one suspended heartbeat, Evelyn was certain he knew. Certain he could see straight through the deception to the terrified girl underneath. His gaze moved across her face with the methodical intensity of a general surveying a battlefield, cataloging every detail, measuring every potential weakness. Then he leaned down and kissed her. It wasn't romantic, wasn't gentle. It was a seal on a contract performed with the same cold efficiency he probably brought to signing military orders. His lips were firm and completely impersonal, making contact for exactly the length of time that tradition required, and not a second longer. Evelyn stood frozen, her first kiss stolen by a man who clearly found the entire ritual distasteful and tried to remember how to breathe. He pulled back, looked at her once more with those Arctic eyes, and turned away without a single word. The archbishop pronounced them bound before the empire. The organ thundered into life with some triumphant recessional that shook dust from the ancient rafters. Lucien offered his arm, not gently, just extended it like he was performing a memorized action, and Evelyn took it because she had no choice. They walked back down the aisle together, husband and wife, while the nobility applauded and the crowd beyond the cathedral doors roared. Evelyn kept her eyes forward and tried not to feel the absolute rigidity of Lucien's arm beneath her hand, the way he held himself as far from her as possible while still maintaining the appearance of unity. This was her life now. This stranger who looked at her like she was a burden he'd been forced to carry. This man whose coldness made the autumn air feel tropical by comparison. They emerged from the cathedral into gray daylight and a storm of rose petals thrown by crowds who had no idea they were celebrating a lie. A new carriage waited, black lacquer chased with gold, the Valmont crest blazing on its doors, a falcon clutching a sword, wings spread in eternal aggression. A footman opened the door and Lucien climbed in without helping her, without looking back, as if he'd already forgotten she existed. Evelyn gathered her skirts and climbed in after him. The interior was all dark leather and polished wood, appointed with the kind of severe luxury that rejected anything resembling comfort. Lucien sat on one side, staring out the window with an expression of absolute disinterest. Evelyn took the opposite seat, leaving as much space between them as the carriage allowed. The door closed. The carriage lurched into motion. They rode in silence through streets lined with cheering crowds, past markets and monuments and fountains where children splashed in defiance of the approaching cold. Evelyn watched the city slide past and tried not to think about how each block carried her farther from everything she'd ever known. Tried not to notice how Lucien hadn't spoken a single word to her since the ceremony. Tried not to calculate how many hours until she'd be expected to consummate this disaster of a marriage. The silence stretched so long it started to feel like a presence of its own, thick and suffocating. Evelyn had always been comfortable with quiet, but this was different. This was weaponized absence, wielded by a man who clearly considered conversation with his new wife to be beneath his notice. Finally, she couldn't bear it anymore. "Your Grace?" "Don't." The word came out flat and sharp, cutting her off with surgical precision. Lucien still hadn't looked at her. still stared out the window like the view of grain warehouses and Cooper's shops was infinitely more interesting than his bride. Evelyn felt heat rise in her chest. Don't speak? Don't attempt basic courtesy? She'd just sacrificed her entire future to save her family, had walked into a marriage she didn't want with a man she didn't know, and he couldn't even tolerate the sound of her voice? I was only going to... I said, don't. This time he did turn to look at her, and the expression on his face made her breath catch. It wasn't anger exactly. It was something colder and more absolute. The look of a man who had already dismissed her as irrelevant and resented being forced to acknowledge her existence even for a moment. We don't need to pretend this is anything other than what it is, he said. A political arrangement neither of us wanted. You'll have rooms in the East Wing. I'll have my own quarters. We'll appear together when absolutely necessary for public functions. Beyond that, stay out of my way and we'll both survive this with minimal damage. Each word landed like a stone thrown at glass. Evelyn stared at him, trying to reconcile the brutal efficiency of his dismissal with the fact that they'd been married for less than an hour. She'd expected coldness. The rumors about the Grand Duke's temperament were legendary, but this was something else entirely. This was a man who had already decided she was worthless and was making absolutely certain she understood her place. Something shifted inside her, a spark of anger that burned through the fear and shame and exhaustion. She'd spent her entire life being overlooked, being the daughter who wasn't quite smart enough, or pretty enough, or interesting enough to warrant attention. But she'd be damned if she'd let this arrogant bastard reduce her to furniture before the wedding carriage even reached his fortress. I understand you didn't choose this marriage, she said, keeping her voice level. Neither did I. But we're bound now, whether either of us likes it. The least we can do is attempt basic civility. Lucien's eyes narrowed. Basic civility would require me to believe you're capable of understanding what that means. The Hartwell family sent me a bride as payment for political protection, and I accepted because the Emperor insisted. That's the entire extent of our relationship. Don't dress it up as something requiring warmth or companionship. The Hartwell family, he'd said, as if she were some abstract representative of a name rather than a person. Evelyn felt her nails dig into her palms beneath the gloves. You know nothing about me. I know everything I need to know. He turned back to the window. You're the eldest daughter of a gambling addict who destroyed his family's fortune and reputation in 6 months of spectacular incompetence. You're here because your father needed someone to clean up his mess, and marrying you off to me was the only option that kept him out of debtor's prison. You'll spend your time shopping and gossiping with other useless nobility, accumulating gowns and jewels while contributing nothing of substance to anyone. Did I miss anything? The casual cruelty of it stole her breath. Not because it wasn't partially true, her father had indeed gambled away their fortune, but because of the absolute contempt with which he delivered the assessment. Like she was a problem already solved, a box already checked, unworthy of any further consideration. Evelyn looked at this man who was now legally her husband and felt something crack open inside her chest. Not heartbreak, you couldn't break what hadn't been offered. Something deeper and more dangerous. A kind of clarity about exactly what kind of life she'd just condemned herself to. The carriage climbed a long hill, and the city fell away below them. Ahead, perched on a granite outcropping that jutted from the landscape like a blade, Valmont Castle rose against storm clouds gathering in the north. It was massive, all black stone and narrow windows, more fortress than palace. No gardens softened its edges, no banners declared welcome. It looked exactly like what it was, a stronghold built by people who expected to be attacked and planned to survive through pure stubborn brutality. This was her home now, this prison dressed up as power. The carriage passed through gates tall enough to admit siege engines, then across a courtyard where guards in Valmont livery stood at attention with the rigid discipline of men who'd served in actual combat. Servants lined the entrance steps, 24 of them in gray uniforms, their faces carefully neutral as they watched the Grand Duke return with his new bride. The carriage stopped. A footman opened the door, and Lucien stepped out without waiting, without offering a hand, already striding toward the entrance, like a general returning to headquarters after an inconvenient errand. Evelyn climbed down alone and stood for a moment looking up at the castle walls, at the windows that stared down like dead eyes, at the life she'd just entered. A woman detached from the line of servants and approached. She was perhaps 50, dressed in black with a chatelaine at her waist that held enough keys to lock away the entire world. Her face was stern but not unkind, and when she spoke, Her voice carried the authority of someone who'd been managing this household longer than Evelyn had been alive. Your Grace, I'm Mrs. Thornberry, the head housekeeper. If you'll follow me, I'll show you to your quarters. Your Grace. The title sounded strange applied to her, like clothing that didn't quite fit. Evelyn nodded and followed the housekeeper up the steps and through doors that closed behind her with the finality of a tomb ceiling. The interior of Valmont Castle was exactly as cold as she'd expected. High ceilings disappeared into shadow. Portraits of dead Valmonts lined the walls, their painted eyes following her with what looked like pity or contempt. The floors were polished stone that swallowed the sound of their footsteps, and the air smelled faintly of beeswax and something older, like the accumulated weight of centuries. Mrs. Thornberry led her through corridors that twisted and climbed, past rooms filled with furniture shrouded in dust covers, past windows that showed glimpses of the city far below. Servants they passed bowed or curtsied, their eyes flicking to Evelyn with barely concealed curiosity before darting away. She could imagine what they were thinking. Another bride, another woman foolish enough to marry into this family. How long until this one breaks? They climbed a staircase that spiraled up what must have been the East Wing Tower. At the top, Mrs. Thornberry produced one of her many keys and unlocked a heavy oak door. Your quarters, Your Grace. His Grace's rooms are in the West Wing. There's a connecting passage if needed, but he's requested it remain locked from both sides. Of course he had. Evelyn stepped into what would be her prison for however long this marriage lasted. The rooms were actually beautiful, in an austere way. A sitting room with tall windows overlooking the city, furnished with chairs upholstered in dove gray silk. A bedroom beyond with a four-poster bed draped in white linen, a writing desk positioned to catch the morning light, wardrobes of carved walnut waiting to be filled. Everything was elegant and expensive and completely impersonal, like a very exclusive hotel suite. The staff will bring your things shortly, Mrs. Thornberry said. Dinner is served at 8 in the private dining room. His Grace typically dines alone, but he's requested you join him tonight. Requested. The word was chosen carefully, but Evelyn heard the truth beneath it. Ordered, commanded. She nodded. Thank you, Mrs. Thornberry. The housekeeper hesitated, and for a moment something almost gentle crossed her stern features. If you need anything, Your Grace, anything at all, please ring. The staff here are loyal to the household, and that includes you now. It was kindness, unexpected and brief, but it made Evelyn's throat tighten dangerously. She managed another nod, and Mrs. Thornberry left, closing the door with a soft click that somehow sounded like a lock engaging. Alone. Evelyn stood in the center of her beautiful prison and felt the full weight of what she'd done crash over her. She'd married a man who despised her. She was living under a false name in a castle that felt more like a mausoleum. Her sister was missing, possibly in danger, and Evelyn had no way to search for her without revealing the entire deception. Her family was safe for now, but that safety was built on a foundation of lies that could collapse at any moment. She walked to the window and looked out over Aranthea spread below like a map drawn in gray stone and terracotta roofs. Somewhere down there, people were living normal lives, falling in love honestly, making choices that weren't forced by desperation, building futures that didn't require deception. Evelyn pressed her forehead against the cold glass and tried not to cry. Hours passed. Servants brought her trunks. Clarissa's trunks. Filled with Clarissa's clothes and Clarissa's favorite perfumes and Clarissa's books. Evelyn unpacked mechanically, hanging gowns she'd never wear and arranging cosmetics she'd never use, building the facade of Clarissa Hartwell's life piece by careful piece. At 7:30, a maid appeared to help her dress for dinner. The girl was young, maybe 16, with nervous hands and a tendency to apologize for everything. She laced Evelyn into an evening gown of deep burgundy silk, arranged her hair into something approximating elegance, and vanished the moment she finished like she was afraid to linger. At 8 exactly, another knock. A footman to escort her to the dining room. Evelyn followed him down more corridors and through more shadows until they reached a room lit by a chandelier that looked like it held 1,000 candles. A table stretched beneath it, easily long enough to seat 40 people, but only 2 places had been set, one at each end, separated by acres of polished wood. Lucien was already seated at the far end. He'd changed into evening clothes that were somehow even more severe than his wedding coat, all black except for a white shirt that made his pale eyes look even colder. He didn't rise when she entered. didn't acknowledge her at all until the footman had seated her and vanished. Then he looked up from the papers he'd been reading and studied her with the same cold assessment he'd used in the cathedral. "You'll have 3 primary duties as Grand Duchess," he said, as if they were resuming a conversation they'd never started. "First, appear at my side during necessary public functions, the Emperor's birthday celebration, the winter military review, various state dinners. You'll smile, stay silent unless directly addressed, and leave when I indicate." Evelyn picked up her wine glass and took a long drink, buying time to control her temper. "Second," he continued, "you'll maintain the household accounts and manage the staff. Mrs. Thornberry will provide guidance, but ultimately you're responsible for ensuring this place runs smoothly. I don't tolerate waste or inefficiency. Third." He set down the papers and fixed her with a look that made her feel like she was being inventoried like furniture. "You'll produce an heir. Not immediately, I'm not that cruel, but within 2 years. After that, your obligations to me are fulfilled and we can live entirely separate lives." The words hung in the candlelit air like a verdict. Evelyn set down her wine glass with enough force that the crystal rang against the wood. "You make it sound like I'm livestock. You're a duchess, which in practical terms means you're a political asset with specific functions. I'm simply clarifying what those functions are." "How generous!" Something flickered across his face. Surprise, maybe, that she'd dare use sarcasm. But it vanished quickly, replaced by that same glacial indifference. Servants appeared with dinner. Course after course of elaborate dishes that Evelyn barely tasted, too angry to have any appetite. Lucien ate efficiently and without apparent enjoyment, treating the meal like fuel. Between courses, he returned to his papers, reading military reports or financial documents with the same focus he'd probably bring to planning a battle. Evelyn watched him across the vast expanse of table and tried to find anything human beneath the armor of his control. But if it existed, he'd buried it deep. "May I ask," she said finally, breaking another long silence, "why you agreed to this marriage if you find the entire concept so distasteful?" He didn't look up from his papers. The Emperor made it clear that maintaining his political support required certain concessions. Your father needed protection from his creditors, a mutually beneficial arrangement. And my feelings about being traded like property? Now he did look up, and there was something almost like curiosity in his expression. "Do you actually believe your feelings are relevant to imperial politics? Or are you simply naive enough to think that aristocratic marriages have anything to do with affection?" "I know exactly what this marriage is," Evelyn said, her voice hardening. "But there's a difference between political necessity and deliberate cruelty. You could at least pretend I'm a person instead of a problem you're forced to manage. To what end? We both know the truth. Dressing it up in polite fiction doesn't change reality. And what exactly is the truth in your assessment? That you married me for security and status. That I married you because the alternative was political isolation. That we're both trapped in a situation neither of us wanted, and the only way to survive it with any dignity is to acknowledge its transactional nature and stop pretending otherwise." He delivered this assessment with the clinical precision of a surgeon explaining a terminal diagnosis. Not cruel, exactly, just utterly devoid of anything resembling compassion. Evelyn pushed back her chair and stood. The footmen along the walls straightened in surprise. "You're wrong," she said quietly, "about what I want and why I'm here. But I see no point in trying to convince someone who's already decided I'm beneath his notice. Thank you for clarifying my duties, Your Grace. I'll be certain to fulfill them with all the mechanical efficiency you clearly value above everything else." She turned and walked toward the door, her skirts hissing across the stone floor. "We're not finished eating." His voice stopped her halfway across the room. Evelyn turned back to find him standing now, his hands braced on the table, his expression finally showing something other than cold indifference. Anger, maybe, or shock that she'd dared to walk away. "I've lost my appetite," she said. "You'll have to suffer through the rest of dinner without my decorative presence. You don't have permission to leave. I don't recall asking for it." The silence that followed felt dangerous, like the moment before lightning strikes. Lucien stared at her across the length of the dining room, and Evelyn stared back, refusing to flinch, refusing to apologize, refusing to be reduced to the worthless ornament he clearly believed she was. Something shifted in his expression. Not softening. Lucien Valmont didn't look like a man capable of softness, but a kind of reassessment, like a general realizing the enemy might have more resources than initially calculated. "You're not what I expected," he said finally. "Neither are you, though perhaps my expectations were too generous." She left before he could respond, walking out of the dining room with her head high and her hands shaking. Let him think her defiant or rude or whatever other unflattering adjective he wanted. She'd played the role of meek and overlooked for 22 years. She wouldn't spend the rest of her life doing the same for a man who couldn't even see her clearly enough to realize she wasn't the woman he'd thought he married. The castle corridors were dark and maze-like, lit only by occasional lanterns that cast more shadow than light. Evelyn got lost twice trying to find her way back to the East Wing, too proud to ask one of the servants for help. By the time she finally found the tower stairs, her feet ached from the new shoes and her head throbbed from suppressed tears. She climbed the spiral steps one at a time, using the stone wall for support, and tried not to think about how Clarissa would have handled this so much better. Clarissa would have charmed Lucian, or at least intrigued him enough to earn basic respect. Clarissa never would have ended a wedding dinner by storming out like an angry child. But Clarissa wasn't here, and Evelyn was, and she had no choice but to survive this nightmare somehow. She reached her rooms and locked the door behind her with shaking hands. The fire had been built up while she was at dinner, filling the bedroom with warmth that couldn't quite banish the chill settling into her bones. She struggled out of the burgundy gown alone, too exhausted to ring for the maid, and fell into bed still wearing her shift. Sleep should have been impossible, but it came anyway, dragging her under into dreams of locked doors and distant voices calling a name that wasn't hers. She woke to gray morning light and the sound of rain against the windows. For a confused moment, she didn't remember where she was, and then it all came crashing back. The wedding, the castle, the husband who'd made it abundantly clear she was nothing more than an inconvenient obligation. Evelyn lay very still and stared at the embroidered canopy above the bed. This was her life now, this beautiful prison with a husband who despised her and a deception that would destroy everything if discovered. And somewhere out there, Clarissa was either in danger or in hiding, while Evelyn played the role she'd abandoned. The rain drummed harder against the glass, and somewhere far below in the castle's depths, church bells tolled the hour. 8 chimes, echoing through stone corridors where generations of Valmont wives had learned the same bitter lesson, that marrying into power meant surrendering everything you were and becoming whatever the Grand Duke required you to be. But Evelyn had already surrendered her name, her future, and her freedom. She'd be damned if she'd surrender her soul too. She rose and pulled on a dressing gown, then walked to the window. Below, the city stretched rain-soaked and gray, and beyond it the empire spread to horizons lost in storm clouds. Somewhere in all that vastness was the truth about why Clarissa had run. And somewhere in this fortress was a man who might actually be capable of something other than cold brutality, if only someone could figure out how to reach past the armor he wore. Evelyn pressed her hand against the rain-streaked glass and made herself a promise. She would survive this. Not just endure, but actually live through it with something of herself intact. And maybe, if she was very lucky or very foolish, she'd find a way to turn this disaster into something that didn't feel quite so much like slow drowning. Thunder rolled across the city like artillery fire, and Evelyn Hartwell, who was supposed to be Clarissa Hartwell but wasn't, who'd married a man who couldn't stand to look at her, who'd walked into this fortress knowing it might destroy her, stood alone in her tower and refused to break. Not yet. Not today. The storm had only just begun. The rain continued for 3 days straight, turning the castle grounds into a waterlogged wasteland and the courtyards into shallow lakes that reflected nothing but gray sky. Evelyn spent those first 72 hours learning the architecture of her prison, which corridors led to dead ends, which staircases spiraled up to locked rooms, which windows offered views of the city versus the northern mountains. She mapped the fortress in her mind the way a soldier maps enemy territory, looking for exits that didn't exist and escape routes that all led back to the same truth. She was trapped here, and the only way out was through. Lucien vanished completely after their disaster of a wedding dinner. Mrs. Thornberry mentioned in passing that His Grace had urgent business with the Imperial Military Council, which apparently required him to spend 16 hours a day locked in his study reviewing troop deployments and supply chain logistics. Evelyn suspected the urgent business was mostly an excuse to avoid his new wife, but she didn't push the issue. The distance gave her breathing room to figure out how to survive in a household that ran with the rigid efficiency of an army barracks. On the fourth morning, the rain finally broke. Weak sunlight filtered through the storm clouds, and Evelyn woke to the sound of servants moving through the corridors with more energy than she'd heard since arriving. She dressed herself, still too self-conscious to ring for the young maid, and made her way down to the breakfast room that Mrs. Thornberry had shown her on the second day. The room was smaller than the formal dining hall, with windows overlooking a courtyard where water still dripped from stone gargoyles. A sideboard held covered dishes kept warm over spirit lamps, and a single place had been set at the table. Evelyn served herself eggs and toast and sat down to eat alone, which had become her routine. Solitary meals in a castle full of people. It would have been poetic if it wasn't so pathetic. She was halfway through her coffee when the door opened and Lucien walked in. He stopped when he saw her, clearly not expecting anyone to be there. For a moment they just stared at each other across the breakfast room, and Evelyn had the absurd thought that he looked tired. The kind of exhaustion that came from too many nights pushing yourself past reasonable limits because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant feeling things you'd rather keep buried. "Your Grace," she said, because someone had to break the silence. He nodded once, a sharp economical movement, and walked to the sideboard. She watched him serve himself black coffee and nothing else, then take the chair at the opposite end of the table. Maximum distance. Always maximum distance. They sat in silence while Lucien drank his coffee and Evelyn pretended to be interested in her eggs. The quiet stretched so long it started to feel aggressive, like he was daring her to speak first just so he could shut her down again. She refused to give him the satisfaction. Finally, he set down his cup with a click that sounded loud in the stillness. "Mrs. Thornberry tells me you've been reviewing the household accounts." Evelyn glanced up. It was the first thing he'd said to her in 4 days that wasn't a command or dismissal. She weighed her response carefully. "You assigned me that duty. I'm fulfilling it. And your assessment? Your previous Duchess kept meticulous records, but the expenses have been climbing steadily for 3 years. Either prices are rising across the board, or someone in the supply chain is skimming. Probably the wine merchant. His invoices show quantities that don't match the cellar inventory." She delivered this analysis flatly, the way he delivered everything, and watched for his reaction. Something flickered in his expression, surprise maybe, or the faint ghost of respect, but it vanished before she could be certain. "You found that in 4 days. It's basic arithmetic. The numbers tell a story if you know how to read them. Most women of your class can barely balance a social calendar, let alone catch fraud in ledger books." Evelyn set down her fork with more force than necessary. "Most women of my class weren't raised by a father who gambled away the family fortune. I learned accounting because someone had to understand exactly how bad our debts were getting." The words came out sharper than she intended, edged with old bitterness. Lucien studied her with that same cold assessment he'd used in the wedding carriage, and she realized she'd just revealed something true about herself, something that didn't fit the useless ornament narrative he'd constructed. "Fix it," he said finally. "The wine merchant and any other suppliers you find padding their invoices. Mrs. Thornberry has the authority to terminate contracts on your recommendation, just like that. No question about whether she was capable, no demand to see her work, just immediate trust in her competence." It should have felt like a victory, but instead it felt like a test, like he was waiting for her to fail so he could confirm his original assessment. "I'll have a full report by the end of the week. See that you do." He stood, draining the last of his coffee in one swallow, and headed for the door. Evelyn watched him go and felt that same spark of anger that had carried her through the wedding dinner. This man who couldn't spare her 5 minutes of actual conversation, but somehow trusted her to overhaul his household finances. This walking contradiction, who treated human connection like a strategic weakness, but ran an empire with terrifying competence. "Your Grace," she said, stopping him at the threshold. He turned back, impatience clear in every line of his posture. "I need access to the staff employment records. If there's fraud in the supply chain, there might be collusion inside the household." For a long moment, he just looked at her, and Evelyn had the distinct impression she was being catalogued and filed away in some mental archive he kept on potential threats and useful assets. "I'll have them sent to your rooms this afternoon." Then he was gone, the door closing behind him with a finality that felt practiced. Evelyn sat alone in the breakfast room and tried to figure out what had just happened. It wasn't warmth, Lucien Valmont didn't seem capable of warmth, but it was something, acknowledgement maybe, recognition that she might be marginally more useful than decorative furniture. The bar was so low it was practically underground, but she'd apparently cleared it. She finished her breakfast and spent the rest of the morning with Mrs. Thornberry, going through the household accounts in exhaustive detail. The housekeeper was a sharp woman who missed nothing and suffered no fools, and she watched Evelyn with the careful attention of someone deciding whether to be an ally or an obstacle. "You have a head for numbers, Your Grace," Mrs. Thornberry said as they reviewed the quarterly expenditures for the third time. "That's rare in someone your age. I had good motivation to learn." Evelyn ran her finger down a column of figures that didn't add up correctly. "How long has the wine merchant been supplying the castle?" 12 years. He came highly recommended by the previous Grand Duchess." Evelyn made a note in the margin. "And when did these discrepancies start?" Mrs. Thornberry pulled out an older ledger and flipped through the pages. "About 3 years ago, right after she passed away." There it was, the moment when oversight had slipped and someone had seen an opportunity. Evelyn felt a grim satisfaction at having her theory confirmed. Numbers always told the truth if you knew how to listen. They worked through lunch, breaking only when a maid brought tea and small sandwiches that neither of them touched. By mid-afternoon, Evelyn had identified 4 suppliers with suspicious billing patterns and 2 servants whose spending habits seemed incompatible with their salaries. Mrs. Thornberry took notes with the efficiency of a general planning a campaign. "What do you recommend, Your Grace?" "Terminate the supplier contracts immediately and put out requests for new bids. As for the servants, I want to interview them before making accusations. There might be legitimate explanations." Mrs. Thornberry's expression shifted into something that might have been approval. The previous Duchess would have simply dismissed them without inquiry. The previous Duchess sounds like she preferred easy solutions to correct ones. A flicker of a smile crossed the housekeeper's stern face. "You're not what I expected when His Grace announced he was marrying. That seems to be a common refrain." "What were you expecting?" "Someone more like her sister, truthfully. The rumors said Lady Clarissa was quite spirited." Evelyn's blood went cold. She forced herself to keep her expression neutral, to not react to hearing her own name spoken like she was someone else entirely. This was the danger she'd known was coming but hadn't prepared for. People who knew Clarissa, who had expectations about what the new Duchess should be like, who might notice the substitution. "Rumors are often exaggerated," she said carefully. Mrs. Thornberry nodded. "Well, you strike me as someone with more substance than spirit. That might serve you better in this house." She gathered her ledgers and left, and Evelyn sat very still in the sudden silence, her heart hammering against her ribs. This was the razor's edge she walked every day. One slip, one inconsistency, one person who knew Clarissa well enough to see through the deception. The weight of it pressed down on her shoulders like physical force. That evening at dinner, another silent meal at opposite ends of the absurdly long table, Lucien spoke exactly 3 sentences. "The Emperor has requested our presence at the autumn military review next week. You'll need appropriate attire. Mrs. Thornberry will arrange it." Evelyn nodded and said nothing, too exhausted from the day's work to attempt conversation that would be rebuffed anyway. She watched him read his military reports between courses and wondered what it must be like to live so completely inside your own head that another person's presence barely registered. After dinner, she returned to her rooms to find a stack of employment files waiting on her desk, just as he'd promised. She spent the next 4 hours going through them page by page, cross-referencing salaries with expenditures, looking for patterns that might explain the discrepancies. The work was tedious and her eyes burned from the candlelight, but it beat lying awake, staring at the ceiling and thinking about how badly this could all collapse. She found it just past midnight. A footman named Marcus Webb, who'd been employed for 5 years and whose salary should have left him barely scraping by, but whose mother in the city had suddenly received enough money 2 years ago to open a small haberdashery. The timing matched the start of the wine merchant's inflated invoices. The connection was circumstantial but strong enough to warrant investigation. Evelyn made careful notes and finally allowed herself to sleep. The next morning, she requested a private meeting with Marcus Webb in the household office. Mrs. Thornberry arranged it without comment, but Evelyn saw the housekeeper's sharp gaze tracking her movements with new interest. Marcus Webb was in his late 20s, handsome in an unremarkable way, with the kind of practiced deference that servants developed after years of being invisible to nobility. He stood before Evelyn's desk with his hands clasped and his eyes down, waiting. Evelyn let the silence stretch for a long moment, watching him. There was tension in his shoulders, a tightness around his mouth that spoke of nerves barely controlled. "Mr. Webb," she said finally, "how long have you worked at Valmont Castle?" 5 years, Your Grace. And in that time, have you had any complaints about your wages or working conditions? No, Your Grace. The household has always treated me fairly. Yet your mother was able to open a shop 2 years ago. On what capital, if I may ask? His jaw tightened. She'd been saving for years, Your Grace. Evelyn pulled out the ledger she'd prepared and turned it so he could see the numbers. According to these records, your mother was still taking in laundry and mending work up until the month before the shop opened. Then suddenly she had enough capital to secure a lease and stock inventory. That's quite a dramatic change in fortune. Marcus Webb went very pale. His eyes flicked to the ledger and then away, and Evelyn saw the exact moment he realized he'd been caught. "I think you've been receiving payments from someone outside this household," she said, keeping her voice level. "Payments in exchange for information about wine deliveries and cellar inventory. And I think that person has been using that information to inflate invoices and pocket the difference." The silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. Marcus's hands trembled where they gripped each other. "I didn't mean for it to go on this long," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Mr. Hendricks, the wine merchant, he approached me 2 years ago, said he could help my mother if I just confirmed some delivery details. I thought it was harmless. Just numbers. Numbers that cost this household thousands of crowns." "I know." His voice cracked. "I know, and I'm sorry. I tried to stop, but he said he'd tell His Grace I was stealing, that he'd make sure I was arrested." Evelyn held up a hand, cutting him off. She felt no satisfaction in this, only a tired recognition of how easily desperation could twist someone into making terrible choices. She'd walked into a marriage built on lies to save her family. Who was she to judge Marcus Webb for trying to save his mother? "You're dismissed from service effective immediately," she said. "No references, but also no criminal charges. You have until tonight to collect your things and leave the castle." He stared at her like she'd just offered him salvation. "Your Grace, thank you. I swear I never meant—" "Go, Mr. Webb." He fled, and Evelyn sat alone in the office, feeling older than her 22 years. She'd just made her first real decision as Grand Duchess, and it had been an act of mercy disguised as justice. The old Evelyn, the overlooked daughter who'd spent her life trying to be good and kind and worthy of notice, that girl would have been proud. But the new Evelyn, the one learning to survive in this fortress of power and secrets, she knew mercy was a luxury she might not always be able to afford. That afternoon, she sent word to Lucian through Mrs. Thornberry. Supply chain fraud confirmed. Primary conspirator identified and contracts terminated. Recommend full audit of remaining suppliers. His response came back within the hour, delivered on a card in his sharp, precise handwriting. "Well done. Proceed as you see fit." 4 words. That was it. No thanks, no acknowledgement of the hours she'd spent hunting through records, no recognition that she'd just saved his household a considerable amount of money, just permission to continue doing the work he'd assigned her. Evelyn crumpled the card in her fist and threw it into the fireplace. The autumn military review was held on a field outside the city walls, where 10,000 imperial troops assembled in perfect formation under cold October skies. Evelyn stood beside Lucien on a raised platform reserved for senior nobility and tried not to feel completely out of place in a gown that cost more than some houses. The soldiers moved through their drills with mechanical precision, formations shifting like living geometry, cavalry charges that shook the ground, artillery demonstrations that left her ears ringing. It was impressive and terrifying, a reminder that the Empire's power rested on the ability to organize violence with devastating efficiency. Lucien watched it all with the focused attention of a man who understood warfare intimately. He stood with his hands clasped behind his back, his expression unreadable, occasionally making notes in a small leather journal. Other nobles around them whispered and gossiped and drank champagne like they were at a garden party. But Lucien was utterly absorbed in analyzing troop movements and tactical formations. Evelyn found herself watching him instead of the soldiers. This was his world, strategy and strength, power measured in battalions and siege engines. Here, he wasn't the cold aristocrat forcing himself through political obligations. Here he was actually present, actually engaged. It made her wonder what else might capture his attention if he ever allowed himself to be interested in something beyond military dominance. The emperor appeared midway through the review, surrounded by guards and sycophants, waving to the troops with the vague benevolence of someone who'd never actually held a weapon in combat. He made his way along the platform, greeting nobles, and when he reached Lucien and Evelyn, his smile took on a calculating edge. "Grand Duke Valmont, so pleased you could join us. And this must be your new Duchess. Your Imperial Majesty." Lucien's bow was precisely calibrated, respectful but not obsequious. "May I present my wife, Clarissa?" The false name hit Evelyn like a slap every single time she heard it. She curtsied low and kept her eyes down, playing the role of demure aristocratic wife exactly as Lucien had demanded. "Charming," the emperor said, and the word felt like an insult wrapped in silk. "You must be very proud, Valmont. Such a beneficial alliance for both your houses." "Mutually beneficial, your majesty." The emperor laughed, a sound with no warmth in it. "Indeed. Tell me, has your duchess had the pleasure of meeting the imperial court yet? We're holding a state dinner in 3 weeks. I trust you'll both attend?" It wasn't a request. Evelyn felt Lucien's hand settle on the small of her back, the first time he'd touched her since their wedding kiss. And the pressure was clear. "Behave. Stay silent. Let me handle this. We would be honored, your majesty." "Excellent." The emperor's gaze slid to Evelyn and lingered just long enough to make her skin crawl. "I look forward to getting to know the new Grand Duchess better. Such a dramatic change from the sister we all expected, isn't it?" Evelyn's heart stopped. She forced herself to keep breathing, to maintain her pleasant, neutral expression, to give nothing away. Beside her, she felt Lucien go very still. "Change can be advantageous, your majesty," he said, and his voice had taken on a dangerous edge that made the emperor's smile falter slightly. Of course. Well, don't let me keep you from enjoying the review." He moved on to the next cluster of nobles, and Lucien's hand dropped from Evelyn's back like she'd burned him. They stood in rigid silence while the artillery demonstration continued, and Evelyn's mind raced through terrible possibilities. Did the emperor know? Was that comment a warning, or just casual cruelty? How many other people had noticed that the new Duchess didn't match descriptions of Clarissa Hartwell? "We're leaving," Lucien said abruptly. He didn't wait for her response, just started walking toward the carriages. Evelyn hurried after him, trying to keep up with his long strides without tripping over her ridiculous gown. They climbed into the carriage in silence, and the moment the door closed, Lucien turned on her with an expression that made her press back against the seat. "What did the emperor mean about dramatic change from your sister?" Evelyn's throat went dry. She'd prepared lies for this moment, had rehearsed explanations in case anyone questioned the substitution, but under the laser focus of Lucien's attention, every excuse she'd invented crumbled to dust. "People expected Clarissa to be more outgoing," she managed. "I've always been quieter." That's not what he meant. "Then I don't know what he meant, Your Grace. You'd have to ask him." It was a deflection, and they both knew it. Lucien stared at her for a long moment, and Evelyn stared back, refusing to flinch, refusing to give ground. If he pushed harder, she wasn't sure what she'd say, but she'd be damned if she'd crumble without a fight. Finally, he turned away and looked out the window. "You're hiding something. Everyone hides something. Even you. Especially me. But I'm not the one who showed up at our wedding looking terrified and has spent 2 weeks acting like I might execute you at any moment. You haven't exactly been welcoming. I told you what this marriage is. A political arrangement. If you expected warmth and companionship, you walked in with unrealistic expectations." "I expected basic human decency," Evelyn snapped. "I expected to be treated like a person instead of furniture that happens to be useful with ledgers. But clearly that was too much to ask from the great Grand Duke Valmont." The words hung in the enclosed space of the carriage like thrown knives. Evelyn immediately regretted them. Antagonizing Lucien when he was already suspicious was dangerously stupid, but she couldn't take them back now. To her shock, his expression shifted into something that might have been respect. "You have more spine than I gave you credit for." Is that supposed to be a compliment? It's an observation. Most people are too intimidated to speak to me honestly. Maybe that's because you've built your entire life around being intimidating. He actually smiled at that. Just a bare flicker at the corner of his mouth, gone almost before she registered it, but it transformed his face for a heartbeat, made him look younger, less armored, almost human. Then it vanished, and he was back to cold assessment. The state dinner in 3 weeks will be difficult, he said, changing the subject with brutal efficiency. The imperial court is a nest of vipers, and they'll be watching you for weakness. Any mistake will be noted and weaponized. I need to know you can handle it. I managed not to embarrass you at the military review. That was a controlled environment with limited social interaction. The state dinner will be hours of performing perfect aristocratic grace, while predators circle looking for opportunities to strike. If they sense you're vulnerable, they'll tear you apart for entertainment. Then teach me what I need to know. The request came out more desperate than she intended, but it was genuine. She had no idea how to navigate imperial court politics, and walking in blind would be suicide. If Lucien could give her even basic guidance, it might be enough to survive. He studied her for a long moment, and something in his expression suggested he was running calculations she couldn't follow. We'll start tomorrow, he said finally. 6 o'clock in the west drawing room. Don't be late. The carriage rolled to a stop at the castle entrance, and Lucien climbed out without another word, leaving Evelyn to follow in his wake like always. But something had shifted between them, some small crack in the wall he'd built around himself. It wasn't warmth, Lucien Valmont didn't do warmth, but it was possibility. And possibility was more than she'd had when she woke up this morning. The next evening at exactly 6 o'clock, Evelyn presented herself at the west drawing room. Lucien was already there, standing by the fireplace with a wine glass in hand and an expression that suggested he was already regretting this decision. Sit, he said, gesturing to a chair positioned in the center of the room. She sat. He walked a slow circle around her, studying her posture with the critical eye of a military inspector. Too stiff. You're holding yourself like you're awaiting punishment. Imperial court politics reward confidence, not deference. Shoulders back, chin level, hands relaxed in your lap. You should look like you belong in every room you enter. Evelyn adjusted her posture, trying to find the balance between elegant and natural. Better. Now, when a nobleman approaches you at the dinner, what's your first priority? Evelyn thought about it. Be polite? Wrong. Your first priority is determining what they want from you. No one at the imperial court makes casual conversation. Every interaction is transactional. They're either seeking information, testing your loyalty, or positioning you as a future asset or enemy. That's exhausting. Welcome to aristocratic life. He took a drink and continued circling. A duke approaches you and asks about my military deployments. How do you respond? I tell him I don't discuss my husband's business. Too defensive. That signals you actually know something worth protecting. Instead, you smile and say something deflecting but not rude. Try it. Evelyn imagined the scenario and made her voice light. I'm afraid His Grace doesn't bore me with military details when there are far more interesting things to discuss. Like the quality of your vineyards, Your Grace. I hear the vintage this year is exceptional. Lucien paused mid-step. That was actually good. The subtle insult about his real interest being wine instead of genuine concern. The redirect to something flattering. Where did you learn that? I've spent my whole life being underestimated. You pick up tricks. He resumed circling. Another scenario. A duchess mentioned she heard rumors about your sister's sudden disappearance before the wedding. She's fishing for scandal. What do you say? This one was harder because it hit too close to truth. Evelyn took a breath and channeled every ounce of aristocratic disdain she'd ever witnessed. How fascinating that people have time for such provincial gossip. My sister was traveling, as young women of quality often do. Perhaps if the Duchess had daughters, she'd understand the value of broadening one's horizons before marriage. Lucien actually laughed. It was a short, sharp sound that seemed to surprise him as much as it surprised her. Brutal. That'll shut down the inquiry and make her feel stupid for asking. Well done. They drilled for 2 hours. Scenario after scenario, teaching her how to read power dynamics and deflect questions and position herself as too dangerous to attack casually. Lucien was a ruthless teacher, offering no praise except the occasional satisfied nod when she successfully navigated a particularly difficult situation. But he was also effective. Evelyn felt her confidence building with each exchange, felt herself learning the language of power that had always been foreign to her. When they finally stopped, it was fully dark outside and her head ached from concentration. "That's enough for tonight," Lucian said. "We'll continue tomorrow, same time." He started to leave, but Evelyn's voice stopped him. "Why are you doing this?" "Helping me, I mean. You made it clear I'm just a political obligation." He turned back, and for once his expression was readable. "Because if you fail at the state dinner, it reflects on me. And I don't fail at anything." "Is that the only reason?" He regarded her silently for several heartbeats, and Evelyn had the strange sensation of being truly seen for the first time since she'd arrived. Not assessed as a problem or measured as an asset, actually seen. "No," he said finally. "But it's the reason I'm willing to admit." Then he left, and Evelyn sat alone in the drawing room trying to parse what had just happened. Lucien Valmont had spent 2 hours teaching her to survive the imperial court with a patience and focus she hadn't known he possessed. And at the end he'd admitted, however obliquely, that his motivation went beyond simple self-interest. It wasn't affection, wasn't even friendship, but it was something other than contempt, and right now that felt like victory. The tutoring sessions continued every evening for the next 2 weeks. Lucien drilled her relentlessly on court etiquette and political maneuvering, on reading faces and controlling her own reactions, on the 1,000 tiny ways power operated in aristocratic spaces. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the sessions became less like interrogations and more like conversations. He started asking her opinions on political situations instead of just testing her responses, started explaining the deeper context behind court rivalries, started treating her less like furniture that needed programming and more like an actual partner in maintaining his political position. Evelyn found herself looking forward to those evenings, not because the work was enjoyable, it was grueling and stressful, but because for 2 hours a day she got to see the man underneath the armor, the brilliant strategist who could analyze a room full of people in seconds, the perfectionist who couldn't tolerate inefficiency, the isolated figure who'd built walls so high he'd forgotten what it felt like to let anyone close. On the 13th evening, a week before the state dinner, Lucian paused in the middle of a scenario about navigating marriage proposals from rival houses. "You're different than I expected," he said abruptly. Evelyn set down the wine glass she'd been holding. "You've mentioned that before." "I know, but I'm starting to understand what I meant." He walked to the window and stood looking out over the city lights scattered across the darkness. Evelyn waited, sensing he was working up to something. "When the Emperor forced this marriage, I assumed you'd be like every other aristocratic woman I've known. Shallow, manipulative, interested only in status and jewels and gossip. I was prepared to endure you the way I endure most political obligations, with grim efficiency and minimal emotional investment. That's a lovely image of matrimony." He glanced back at her and there was something almost apologetic in his expression. "But you're not what I prepared for. You actually care about running this household well. You caught fraud I'd been tolerating for years out of sheer inattention. You're learning court politics not because you enjoy them, but because you understand they're necessary for survival. That's not shallow. That's strategic intelligence." Evelyn felt heat rise in her chest, part pride, part terror that he was getting too close to seeing past her deception. "Thank you, I think. It makes me realize I've been unfair to you." The admission hung in the air between them like something fragile. Lucien Valmont, who never apologized for anything, was coming as close to contrition as his nature probably allowed. Evelyn stood and walked to join him at the window. The city sprawled below them, a constellation of lights and shadows where thousands of people lived normal lives without the weight of impossible secrets. "You were protecting yourself," she said quietly, "from an arrangement you didn't want with a person you didn't know. I understand that. Do you?" She thought about all the walls she'd built around her own truth, all the lies she maintained every waking moment just to survive. "Yes, I do." They stood side by side in silence, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body. And for the first time since arriving at this fortress, Evelyn felt something other than fear or exhaustion. She felt seen, actually recognized as a person rather than a problem. It was dangerous and fragile and completely terrifying. The night before the state dinner, Evelyn couldn't sleep. She lay in her enormous bed staring at the embroidered canopy and ran through every scenario Lucien had taught her, every deflection and power play and subtle manipulation. She'd learned the aristocratic game well enough to be functional, but tomorrow would be the real test. She must have finally dozed off because the next thing she knew, someone was pounding on her door, and pale dawn light filtered through the curtains. Evelyn stumbled out of bed and pulled on a dressing gown. Mrs. Thornberry stood in the hallway looking more shaken than Evelyn had ever seen her. "Your Grace, you need to come quickly. There's been an incident." Evelyn's blood went cold. "What kind of incident?" "One of the junior maids found something in your rooms. A letter. She brought it to me before reading it, but I thought you should see it immediately." The housekeeper handed over a folded paper sealed with wax. Evelyn recognized the handwriting on the outside immediately. Her heart stopped. It was addressed to Clarissa Hartwell, in Clarissa's own hand. Her sister had sent a letter to the castle, to herself, to the woman everyone thought was living here. Evelyn's hand shook as she broke the seal and unfolded the paper. The message inside was brief and written in the private code they'd developed as children. Simple enough to read if you knew the key, complete gibberish to anyone else. But the meaning was clear. "I'm in danger, they know. Don't trust anyone. Coming for you." Evelyn read it 3 times while her world tilted sideways. Clarissa was alive, Clarissa was in danger, and someone, Evelyn had no idea who, knew something they shouldn't about the wedding, the substitution, the entire deception. She looked up to find Mrs. Thornberry watching her with sharp concern. "Your Grace? Is everything all right?" Everything was falling apart. The careful lies she'd maintained were crumbling. In less than 12 hours, she'd have to perform flawlessly at the imperial court, while knowing her sister was out there somewhere in danger, while wondering who knew the truth and what they planned to do with that information. She folded the letter carefully and forced her voice steady. "Everything's fine. Just correspondence from family. Thank you for bringing it directly to me." Mrs. Thornberry looked unconvinced, but nodded. "Of course, Your Grace. Will you be needing anything else?" "No, you can go." The housekeeper left, and Evelyn stood alone in her doorway, holding the letter that had just destroyed any illusion of safety. She had exactly 8 hours before the state dinner. 8 hours to figure out what to do with this information. 8 hours before she walked into a room full of predators, while her entire foundation cracked beneath her feet. She thought about telling Lucy, confessing everything, and hoping his pragmatic nature would outweigh his rage at the deception. But that was too dangerous, too unpredictable. She thought about running, disappearing the way Clarissa had, but that would destroy her family and solve nothing. No. She'd come this far surviving on lies and determination. She'd make it through one more night. She dressed for the state dinner with trembling hands, letting the nervous maid lace her into an emerald gown that cost more than most people earned in a year. Diamonds borrowed from the Valmont collection glittered at her throat and wrists. She looked every inch the Grand Duchess. She looked like a woman about to walk into an execution. Lucien was waiting in the entrance hall when she descended the stairs. He wore full formal dress, midnight blue coat with the medals he'd earned in the Northern Wars, pale gray waistcoat, boots polished to a mirror shine. He looked like exactly what he was, the most dangerous man in the Empire. He watched her approach, and something in his expression shifted. "You look terrified." "I'm fine." "You're not. What happened?" Evelyn opened her mouth to lie, to deflect, to maintain the fiction for just a few more hours, but the weight of it all, the secrets, the fear, the knowledge that Clarissa was in danger and she was powerless to help, it crushed down on her and she couldn't find the strength to carry it alone anymore. "I need to tell you something," she said. "After the dinner. When we get back. It's important." Lucien studied her face with that penetrating focus that seemed to see straight through flesh to bone. "Is it about the substitution?" The world stopped. Everything went silent except for the thunder of her own heartbeat. "What?" He stepped closer, close enough that she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. "Did you really think I wouldn't notice? That I married the wrong sister?" Evelyn couldn't breathe, couldn't think. He knew. He'd known all along, and he'd let her lie and pretend. And when? She managed. "When did you figure it out?" "Our wedding night. You don't walk like her. Don't hold yourself the same way. I've met Clarissa twice at imperial functions. She was taller, more dramatic in every gesture. You're quieter, more controlled. By the second day, I was certain. Then why didn't you say anything?" "Because I wanted to know why." His voice was soft, almost gentle, and it was somehow more terrifying than his usual coldness. Why would a family risk everything by sending the wrong daughter? What could possibly be worth that deception? I was protecting them. My father, the debts. I know about your father's debts. I know he needed this marriage to survive politically and financially. What I don't know is what happened to your sister. She disappeared 4 days before the wedding. Evelyn's voice cracked. I don't know where she is or why she left. I just knew if I didn't take her place, everything would collapse. And you've been carrying that alone this entire time. It wasn't a question. Lucien reached out slowly, and Evelyn thought he might strike her or grab her or do something violent. Instead, he touched her face with unexpected gentleness, tilting her chin up so she couldn't look away. You're either the bravest person I've ever met or the most foolish. I haven't decided which. Probably both. Definitely both. His thumb brushed across her cheekbone and she realized she was crying. Who else knows? No one. Just you, and apparently someone who sent my sister a warning that they know and she's in danger. Show me the letter. She pulled it from her sleeve where she'd hidden it and watched him read the coded message. His expression went from focused to furious in the space of 2 seconds. This arrived this morning? Yes. And you were planning to attend the state dinner without telling me, without backup or protection or any plan for what to do if someone there is part of this conspiracy. I didn't have a choice. If I refused to go, it would raise questions. If I told you the truth, I didn't know if you'd... Lucien cut her off by pulling her against his chest. It was so unexpected that Evelyn froze, her hands pressed against the metals on his coat, her face buried in the hollow of his shoulder. He held her like that for several heartbeats, one hand cradling the back of her head, and she felt the tension vibrating through him. You'll never be that alone again, he said quietly. Whatever happens tonight, we face it together. Understood? Evelyn nodded against his chest because she didn't trust her voice. He pulled back and looked at her with an expression she'd never seen before, something raw and protective and absolutely ruthless. We're going to that dinner, we're going to perform flawlessly, and we're going to identify whoever sent that letter and make them regret ever threatening what's mine. The possessiveness in those last 2 words should have frightened her. Instead, it felt like the first solid ground she'd stood on in weeks. The carriage arrived. Lucien handed her in and climbed in beside her, not across from her the way he usually sat, but right beside her on the same bench. His hand found hers in the darkness and squeezed once. Tell me everything, he said. Every detail about your sister's disappearance, every suspicion you have, every piece of this puzzle. We have 20 minutes before we reach the palace. Don't waste them. So Evelyn talked, and Lucien listened. And somewhere in the darkness between the castle and the imperial court, the fragile alliance they'd built transformed into something far more dangerous, something that looked an awful lot like partnership, something neither of them could walk away from now, even if they wanted to. The imperial palace rose from the heart of Aranthia like a monument to accumulated power, all white marble and gold leaf designed to make anyone who entered feel insignificant by comparison. Evelyn watched it approach through the carriage window and tried to steady her breathing. Beside her, Lucien sat in focused silence, his hand still gripping hers with enough pressure that she could feel her pulse beating against his palm. They'd spent the 20-minute journey constructing a strategy. Lucien had listened to everything she knew about Clarissa's disappearance with the methodical attention of a general receiving intelligence reports, asking sharp questions that pulled details she hadn't even realized were significant. By the time the carriage rolled through the palace gates, they had a working theory. Someone in the imperial court had discovered the substitution and was using that knowledge as leverage, possibly connected to whatever conspiracy had driven Clarissa into hiding in the first place. The problem was they had no idea who. And walking into a room full of potential enemies without knowing which faces hid threats was the kind of tactical nightmare that could end with Evelyn arrested for fraud and Lucien politically destroyed. The carriage stopped. Lucien released her hand and his expression shifted into the cold mask she'd come to recognize as his armor against the world. Stay close to me tonight, he said. Don't let anyone separate us. If someone asks about your sister, use the deflection I taught you and watch their reaction carefully. People reveal more in their eyes than their words. And if I recognize whoever sent that letter, you don't confront them. You signal me and I'll handle it. How will I signal you? Touch your necklace. His eyes flicked to the diamonds at her throat, 3 times in succession. I'll know. A footman opened the door and Lucien stepped out first, then turned to offer his hand. Evelyn took it and emerged into a courtyard blazing with torchlight and crowded with carriages disgorging nobility in their finest silks and jewels. Everyone was peacocking, displaying wealth and status and power through cut gemstones and imported fabrics. She'd never felt more like an imposter in her life. Lucien tucked her hand into the crook of his arm and they walked toward the palace entrance. She felt eyes tracking them from every direction, felt the weight of scrutiny and judgment, felt the whispers that followed in their wake. The Grand Duke and his mysterious new bride. The alliance no one had seen coming. The marriage that shifted the entire balance of imperial politics. If they only knew how much stranger the truth actually was. Inside the palace was even more overwhelming. Vaulted ceilings covered in frescoes of imperial victories, chandeliers dripping crystal, floors of polished marble that reflected everything like still water. Servants in gold livery directed the flow of guests toward the state dining hall, and Evelyn let Lucien guide her through corridors that smelled of beeswax and expensive perfume. The dining hall was enormous, dominated by a table that could have seated 200 people. Gold candelabra marched down its length, and the walls were hung with tapestries depicting the empire's founding. Nobility clustered in conversational groups, their voices creating a low hum of political maneuvering disguised as social pleasantries. Evelyn scanned the faces looking for anyone who seemed too interested in her, anyone whose attention lingered too long, anyone who might be connected to the warning Clarissa had sent. But everyone looked equally predatory in the candlelight. Sharp eyes calculating advantages, mouths curved into smiles that promised nothing good. Grand Duke Valmont, a man detached from a nearby group and approached with the confident stride of someone used to being welcomed everywhere. He was perhaps 60, distinguished-looking, with silver hair and eyes that were far too intelligent for comfort. Evelyn recognized him from the portraits Lucien had shown her during their tutoring sessions. Duke Sebastian Moreau, Minister of Internal Security and one of the Emperor's closest advisors. Minister Moreau. Lucien's voice was carefully neutral. May I present my wife, the Grand Duchess Clarissa. Evelyn curtsied exactly as she'd been taught. Not too deep, not too shallow, acknowledging status without surrendering dignity. The minister took her hand and pressed it to his lips in a gesture that managed to be both courtly and vaguely threatening. Enchanted, Your Grace. We were all so surprised when you chose the younger sister over the one we'd all met previously. Clarissa has quite the reputation for being spirited. There it was, the first probe. Evelyn felt Lucien's arm tense beneath her hand, but his expression didn't change. Spirited is one word for it, Evelyn said smoothly, deploying the deflection they'd rehearsed, though I prefer to think of myself as simply more practical than dramatic. Less interested in being memorable at parties and more focused on matters of actual substance. The minister's eyes flickered with something that might have been amusement or calculation. How refreshing. So many young women of quality seem to believe charm is a substitute for competence. I found that competent people rarely need to rely on charm. It tends to speak for itself. Lucien made a sound that might have been a suppressed laugh. The minister studied Evelyn with renewed interest, and she fought the urge to touch her necklace and signaled danger. This was just standard court probing, not necessarily connected to the letter. She needed to stay calm and observe. The Emperor is eager to meet you properly, the minister said. He's mentioned several times how unexpected your marriage was. I believe he has questions about the hasty nature of the arrangements. Imperial curiosity is always an honor to satisfy, Lucien said, his voice taking on a dangerous edge. Though I wasn't aware the Emperor required detailed explanations for legal marriages conducted with all proper protocols. Of course not. Of course not. The minister smiled without warmth, merely friendly interest in such a significant political alliance. You understand how these things generate speculation. Speculation is inevitable when people have too much time and too little actual work to occupy them. The verbal sparring continued for another few minutes before the minister excused himself, but Evelyn could feel him watching them as he rejoined his group. She leaned closer to Lucien and pitched her voice low enough that only he could hear. He knows something. Everyone here knows something. The question is whether what he knows is dangerous to us specifically or just generally useful for political leverage. How do we tell the difference? We wait for someone to make a mistake. They circulated through the room for the next hour, engaging in the exhausting dance of imperial court politics. Every conversation was a test. Every question had layers of meaning. Evelyn deployed the techniques Lucian had taught her, deflecting, redirecting, subtly insulting while maintaining plausible deniability, and watched reactions carefully for anything that suggested knowledge of the substitution. A duchess asked pointed questions about her childhood that didn't match Clarissa's actual history. A count mentioned a ball she should have attended but hadn't. A baroness commented on how much taller Clarissa had seemed at previous events. Each probe made Evelyn's pulse spike, but she managed to navigate around them with careful lies wrapped in partial truths. The whole time Lucian stayed at her side like a guard dog, his presence radiating enough latent threat that most people kept their inquiries relatively superficial. She could feel the strain in him, the constant vigilance, the calculation behind every word, the awareness that one slip could unravel everything. Dinner was finally announced and the crowd began flowing toward their assigned seats. Evelyn found herself placed between Lucien and an elderly marquise who spent the first 3 courses describing his hunting dogs in excruciating detail. It should have been boring, but she was grateful for it. Anything that didn't require careful political maneuvering gave her a chance to breathe and observe. The emperor sat at the head of the table, holding court with practiced ease. He was younger than Evelyn had expected, maybe 40, handsome in a soft way that suggested he'd never experienced genuine hardship. His eyes moved constantly around the table, tracking conversations and alliances, measuring the power dynamics in the room. When his gaze landed on Evelyn, she felt it like a physical touch. He smiled and raised his glass in her direction, a gesture that could have been welcoming or mocking depending on interpretation. She returned it with a carefully neutral expression and took a sip of wine that tasted like ashes on her tongue. The courses kept coming, elaborate dishes that were more art than food, each one announced by servants in voices that carried through the massive hall. Evelyn picked at her plate and tried to ignore the growing certainty that something was wrong. Too many people were watching her. Too many conversations stopped when she looked in that direction. The attention felt coordinated, purposeful, like predators circling before a kill. She was reaching for her wine glass when she saw him, a man standing near one of the service doors, partially hidden by a marble column. He was dressed as a servant, but something about his posture was wrong, too alert, too focused, and he was staring directly at her with an intensity that made her blood run cold. Their eyes met across the crowded hall, and recognition hit her like a physical blow. She knew that face, had seen it dozens of times in her family's manor house before everything collapsed. Thomas Brennan, her father's former secretary. The man who'd been dismissed 6 months ago after the gambling debts came to light, who'd vanished from Aranthia entirely according to the rumors. The man who would absolutely know that Evelyn Hartwell was not her sister Clarissa. He smiled. It was not a friendly expression. Then he turned and slipped through the service door, disappearing like smoke. Evelyn's hand shot to her necklace. Once, twice, 3 times. Lucien's head turned toward her immediately, and she saw his eyes sharpen with focus. "What is it?" he asked, his voice pitched low enough that the Marquis on her other side couldn't hear. "Thomas Brennan, our former secretary. Just saw me and left through the service entrance. Are you certain?" "Absolutely. He knows me. Knows the whole family. There's no way he wouldn't recognize the substitution." Lucian's jaw tightened. "Did he seem surprised to see you?" "No." Evelyn's voice shook slightly. "He looked like he'd been waiting for me to notice him. That's a message. He wants you to know he's here, wants you to panic and make mistakes." His hand found hers under the table and squeezed hard. "Don't give him the satisfaction. Stay calm and finish dinner. We'll deal with this after." "But he could expose us at any moment." "He won't. Not here. Not publicly. If he wanted to destroy you with the truth, he'd have done it already. He's playing a longer game." The words made sense, but terror was making it hard to think clearly. Thomas Brennan had been loyal to her father once, had managed the household accounts and correspondence with quiet efficiency. But that loyalty had evaporated when he'd been blamed for not catching the gambling debts earlier, when he'd been dismissed without references and blacklisted from working in any respectable house. He had every reason to want revenge on the Hartwell family, and Evelyn had just handed him the perfect weapon. She forced herself to keep eating, to nod politely at the Marquis's description of his prize hound's impressive lineage, to maintain the facade of calm while her world crumbled internally. Across the table, she saw Minister Moreau, watching her with those two sharp eyes, and she wondered if he was part of this, if the entire evening had been orchestrated to expose her. The emperor rose and the hall fell silent. He raised his glass in a toast that praised the strength of the empire and the nobility that sustained it, generic platitudes delivered with practiced charm. Everyone drank and applauded, and Evelyn mechanically followed along while scanning the room for any sign of Thomas Brennan returning. After dinner came the truly dangerous part, mingling in the palace's grand ballroom where the crowd would be more fluid and separating her from Lucien would be easier. The moment they entered the ballroom, Evelyn felt the shift in energy. The earlier careful politeness was giving way to something more aggressive now that alcohol had loosened tongues and lowered inhibitions. A count approached and asked Lucien for a private word about military contracts. It was clearly a setup to isolate her, but Lucien refused with brutal efficiency, making it clear that anyone who wanted his attention would have to accept his wife's presence as well. The count retreated looking insulted, and Evelyn saw several other nobles exchange knowing glances. "They think you're being controlled by me," Lucien murmured. "Let them. It keeps them from trying to manipulate you directly. What if Thomas talks to them? What if he's already spreading the truth? Then we'll know soon enough. People love gossip too much to keep quiet about something that explosive." The next hour was torture. Evelyn smiled and made polite conversation while every nerve screamed that disaster was imminent. She kept expecting someone to confront her, to publicly announce that the Grand Duchess was a fraud, to watch Lucien's face when he realized, but he already knew. The thought cut through her panic like a blade. Lucien had known from the beginning and chosen to keep her secret. Whatever Thomas Brennan revealed wouldn't change that fundamental fact. The question was whether Lucien would choose to protect her when the truth became public knowledge. She was contemplating this when a servant approached with a silver tray holding a folded note. "For Her Grace the Grand Duchess," the servant said, bowing low. Evelyn took the note with hands that only trembled slightly. The paper was expensive, the kind used for official correspondence, and her name was written in an unfamiliar, elegant script. She unfolded it while Lucien watched over her shoulder. The message inside was brief and devastating. "The Rose Garden in 10 minutes. Come alone, or I tell everyone what you are." No signature, no explanation, just a threat wrapped in silk. Lucien's expression went absolutely glacial. He plucked the note from her fingers and read it again, his jaw working like he was grinding his teeth to powder. "You're not going. I don't have a choice. You absolutely have a choice, and the answer is no. This is obviously a trap. If I don't go, they'll expose everything here in front of the entire court. At least in the garden, there's a chance to negotiate. Negotiate with someone who's already threatened you? That's not strategy. That's suicide. What else am I supposed to do?" She kept her voice low, but couldn't keep the desperation out of it. "I can't let them destroy you along with me. Your political position, your reputation, everything you've built? To hell with my reputation." Lucien's hand shot out and gripped her wrist hard enough to hurt. "You think I care more about what these parasites think than I care about keeping you safe?" The words hit her like a physical blow. She stared at him and saw something in his eyes that terrified her more than any threat. Actual fear. Not for himself. For her. "I have to go," she said quietly. "You know I do." For a long moment, he just looked at her, and she watched him run through tactical calculations trying to find another option. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough. "Then I'm coming with you," the note said alone. "I don't give a damn what the note said. Either we go together, or we leave this palace right now and prepare for war." The absolute certainty in his voice made her want to cry. This man who'd treated her like an inconvenient obligation 6 weeks ago was now ready to burn down his entire political network to protect her. It was terrifying and overwhelming, and she didn't deserve it, but she was too desperate to refuse. "Together then," she whispered. They made their excuses to the nobles surrounding them and moved toward the ballroom's terrace doors. The rose garden lay beyond, accessible through a series of stone pathways lined with torches that cast dancing shadows across carefully manicured hedges. At night it was beautiful and eerie, the kind of place where romantic assignations happened in novels and murders happened in real life. Evelyn's heart hammered against her ribs as they stepped into the cool night air. Lucien kept his hand on the small of her back, a possessive touch that broadcast his presence to anyone watching. They followed the main path deeper into the garden until the ballroom lights faded behind them and the sound of music became distant. A figure stepped out from behind a sculptured hedge. Thomas Brennan looked different than Evelyn remembered, thinner, harder, with the kind of angry energy that came from nurturing grievances into weapons. He smiled when he saw them approaching, and it was the smile of a man who'd been waiting months for this moment. "Lady Evelyn," he said, emphasizing her real name with vicious satisfaction. "Or should I say Grand Duchess Clarissa? It's so hard to keep track of which sister you're pretending to be." Lucian moved forward, but Evelyn grabbed his arm, stopping him. "Let me handle this." "How touching." Thomas's smile widened. The Grand Duke letting his fake wife fight her own battles. "Tell me, Your Grace, does he know you're not actually the woman he married? Or is that particular deception still working?" "He knows," Evelyn said flatly. "Has known from the beginning. So whatever leverage you think you have, you're wrong." Thomas's expression flickered with surprise before hardening again. "Maybe he knows. But does the Emperor? Does the Imperial Court? Does the entire empire that witnessed your wedding and believed they were celebrating the union of Grand Duke Valmont and Clarissa Hartwell? What do you want?" Lucian's voice was cold enough to freeze blood. "Money? A position? Name your price and be done with these theatrical games." "I don't want your money." Thomas took a step closer, and Evelyn saw the rage burning in his eyes. "Your wife's father destroyed my life, dismissed me without references, spread rumors that I'd been stealing, made it impossible for me to work anywhere respectable. I lost everything because Edmund Hartwell needed a scapegoat for his own incompetence. That's not Evelyn's fault." "No, but making her pay for it will hurt him almost as much as he hurt me." Thomas pulled something from his coat, a sheaf of papers that looked official and terrifying. "I have documents here proving that the woman who married you is Evelyn Hartwell, not Clarissa. I have statements from servants at the Hartwell Manor who can confirm the substitution. I have everything I need to bring your entire house down." The words hung in the garden air like poison. Evelyn felt the ground shifting beneath her feet, felt 6 weeks of desperate survival collapsing into ruin. This was it, the moment when all her lies caught up with her and destroyed everything. Lucien stepped forward, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of absolute authority. "You're making a serious mistake." "Am I?" Thomas's confidence wavered slightly at Lucian's tone, but he rallied. "I don't think so. I think I'm about to become very valuable to people who'd love to see the great Grand Duke Valmont brought low by scandal." Before Evelyn could process what was happening, Lucien moved. It was brutally fast. One moment he was standing beside her, the next he had Thomas by the throat, slamming him back against a marble statue hard enough to make the man's teeth click together. "Listen very carefully," Lucien said, his voice deadly quiet. "You're going to give me those papers and every copy you've made. You're going to leave Aranthia tonight and never return. And if I ever hear that you've spoken one word about my wife's identity to anyone, I will find you and I will make you wish you'd never been born." Thomas clawed at Lucian's grip, his face turning red. "You can't. The court will do whatever I tell them to do, because I control more military power than anyone in this empire except the Emperor himself." Lucien's grip tightened. "Do you really think anyone will care about your accusations when I can make you disappear so thoroughly that even your bones won't be found?" It was shocking seeing Lucien like this. Not the cold strategist, but something far more primal and dangerous. This was the man who'd earned his reputation in the Northern Wars, who'd built his power on calculated violence and the willingness to do whatever was necessary to protect what was his. And apparently Evelyn was his. The possessiveness should have terrified her, but instead it felt like salvation. Thomas's struggles were weakening. "Please," he gasped. "I just wanted—" "I don't care what you wanted." Lucien released him, and Thomas collapsed to his knees, coughing. "Give me the papers. Now." With shaking hands, Thomas pulled out the documents and handed them over. Lucien flipped through them quickly. Birth records, household ledgers, statements from servants, everything that would prove Evelyn's true identity. He folded them carefully and tucked them inside his coat. "You have until sunrise to be gone from the capital," Lucien said. "If you're still here when I send people to check, you won't live to see sunset." Thomas scrambled to his feet and stumbled away down the garden path, half running in his desperation to escape. Evelyn watched him disappear into the darkness and felt something inside her crack open. It was done. The immediate threat was gone, but the knowledge of how close they'd come to complete destruction left her shaking. Lucien turned to her and his expression softened from lethal to concerned in the space of a heartbeat. Are you all right? She wanted to say yes, wanted to maintain her composure and dignity. Instead, what came out was a sound somewhere between a laugh and a sob. I thought we were finished. I thought he was going to destroy everything, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. He's not going to destroy anything. Lucien pulled her against his chest and wrapped his arms around her with surprising gentleness. You're safe. I've got you. Evelyn buried her face in his coat and let herself fall apart for just a moment. All the terror and stress and desperate survival of the last 6 weeks came pouring out in silent tears that soaked into expensive fabric. Lucien held her through it without speaking, one hand stroking her hair, and for the first time since arriving at his fortress, she felt genuinely protected. When she finally pulled back and tried to compose herself, he cupped her face in both hands and looked at her with an intensity that stole her breath. No one threatens what's mine, he said quietly. Not Thomas Brennan, not the Imperial Court, not anyone. You understand that? I'm not actually yours. The marriage is built on a lie. The marriage is whatever we decide it is. And I've decided you're my wife in truth, not just legal fiction, if that's acceptable to you. The question hung between them, and Evelyn realized with shocking clarity that everything had changed. This wasn't the cold political arrangement they'd started with. This was something real and terrifying and completely unexpected. Lucien Valmont was offering her actual partnership, actual protection, actual... She kissed him before she could overthink it, pressed up on her toes and covered his mouth with hers in a kiss that was nothing like their careful ceremony performance. This was desperate and grateful and full of 6 weeks of suppressed emotion. Lucien made a surprised sound against her lips and then kissed her back with enough intensity to make her knees weak. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathing hard. That's acceptable to me, Evelyn whispered. Lucien smiled, an actual real smile that transformed his entire face, and kissed her again. They stayed in the garden for several more minutes, holding each other while the distant sounds of the ball continued and the night air cooled around them. Eventually, they'd have to return to the palace, would have to finish performing for the court, would have to navigate the dangerous political waters they'd barely survived tonight. But for now, they had this moment, this fragile truth between them, this partnership forged in crisis and sealed with something that felt dangerously close to actual affection. We should go back, Lucien, Yen said finally, though he didn't release her. Before someone notices we've been gone too long and starts spreading rumors about what we were doing. Let them spread rumors. Maybe it'll make us seem more like a normal couple. Nothing about us is normal. No. But maybe that's not such a terrible thing. They walked back toward the ballroom hand in hand, and Evelyn felt something settling in her chest that might have been hope. The danger wasn't over, wouldn't be over until they found Clarissa and figured out what conspiracy had driven her into hiding. But for the first time since this nightmare began, Evelyn felt like she wasn't facing it alone. They were halfway across the terrace when the screaming started. It came from inside the ballroom, high and terrified, cutting through the music like a knife. Lucien's hand tightened on hers and they ran toward the sound, bursting through the terrace doors into chaos. The crowd had pulled back from the center of the ballroom, forming a wide circle around something on the floor. Nobles stood frozen in shock, glasses forgotten in their hands, faces pale with horror. And in the center of the circle lay a man in formal dress, blood pooling beneath him in a spreading crimson lake. Minister Moreau. His throat had been cut with surgical precision. Evelyn's stomach lurched. She looked away, but not before seeing the paper clutched in the minister's dead hand, white against red, stark and damning. The emperor pushed through the crowd, his face ashen. Someone grabbed the paper and unfolded it, and Evelyn watched horror replace shock in his expression. "What does it say?" a duchess demanded, her voice shrill with panic. The emperor looked up and his eyes found Evelyn across the ballroom with laser focus. "It says the Grand Duchess is a fraud," he said clearly, and his voice carried through the sudden terrible silence. "It says the woman who married Grand Duke Valmont is not Clarissa Hartwell, but her younger sister Evelyn, and that Minister Moreau discovered the truth and was killed to silence him." The ballroom exploded into chaos. Voices shouting, people surging forward, guards moving to block the exits. Evelyn felt the world tilting sideways, felt every eye in the room turning toward her with accusation and shock. This wasn't possible. Thomas Brennan had given up the papers. The threat was neutralized. Unless Thomas hadn't been working alone. Unless someone else had the same information and had been waiting for exactly the right moment to deploy it. Unless this entire evening had been orchestrated not to blackmail her, but to frame her for murder. Lucien's arm came around her waist like iron. "Don't say anything," he murmured against her ear. Not a single word. The Emperor's guards were moving through the crowd toward them. Evelyn saw the calculation in the Emperor's eyes, saw him weighing political advantage against justice, saw him making the decision that would destroy everything. "Grand Duke Valmont," the Emperor said, his voice carrying absolute authority, "you and your wife are under house arrest effective immediately, pending investigation into Minister Moreau's death and the allegations of marriage fraud. Surrender your weapons and come quietly." The guards closed in and Evelyn felt Lucien's body coil with tension like a spring wound too tight. For one terrifying moment she thought he might actually fight them, might try to cut their way out of the palace through sheer violence. His hand moved toward the ceremonial sword at his hip. "Don't," she whispered. "Please. Not like this." She felt the struggle in him, every instinct screaming to protect her through force, every tactical calculation showing how badly that would end. Finally, his hand dropped, and he turned to face the Emperor with cold fury. "This is a setup. Someone murdered Moreau and planted that note to frame my wife." "Perhaps." The Emperor's expression was unreadable. "That's what the investigation will determine. Until then, you're both confined to Valmont Castle under guard. Any attempt to leave or interfere with the inquiry will be considered treason." The guards moved in with drawn swords, and Evelyn felt chains closing around her future. Everything she'd survived, every desperate choice she'd made, all of it collapsing into this nightmare moment where she stood accused of murder in a ballroom full of witnesses while her sister's warning echoed in her memory. "They know. Don't trust anyone." Evelyn looked at the body on the floor, at the blood spreading across marble, at the note clutched in dead fingers that condemned her. Someone had orchestrated this with terrifying precision. Someone who knew her secret and was willing to kill to expose it. Someone who wanted to destroy both her and Lucien in one devastating strike. And whoever they were, they'd just succeeded. The guards escorted them from the ballroom while the nobility watched in shocked silence. Evelyn held her head high and refused to cry, refused to show weakness, refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. Beside her, Lucien radiated leashed violence, and she knew he was already planning their next move, already calculating how to turn this disaster into survival. But as they climbed into the guarded carriage that would return them to Valmont Castle, now transformed from fortress to prison, Evelyn felt the full weight of how badly she'd underestimated the game she was playing. This wasn't about blackmail or leverage or political maneuvering. This was about destruction, complete and absolute. And someone out there in the Empire's shadows had decided that Evelyn Hartwell needed to be erased from existence, along with anyone foolish enough to stand beside her. The carriage rolled through dark streets while guards on horseback flanked them on all sides. Lucien sat across from her now, separated by Imperial command, and the space between them felt like an unbridgeable chasm. His eyes met hers in the darkness, and she saw rage there, and determination, and something that looked almost like desperation. "We're going to survive this," he said quietly. "I swear to you." Evelyn wanted to believe him, wanted to trust that his power and influence would be enough to overcome whoever had framed her for murder. But the memory of Minister Moreau's blood spreading across pristine marble kept replaying in her mind, and she couldn't shake the certainty that this was only the beginning, that whoever had killed him wouldn't stop until both she and Lucien were destroyed. That the conspiracy Clarissa had uncovered was so much bigger and more dangerous than either of them had imagined, and that the only way to survive it would require becoming something neither of them had ever planned to be, ruthless enough to match the enemies circling in the darkness, willing to sacrifice anything and anyone to protect what mattered most. The carriage crossed into Valmont Castle grounds, and the gates closed behind them with the finality of a tomb sealing. House arrest, investigation, accusations of murder and fraud and conspiracy. Everything Evelyn had feared from the moment she'd agreed to this deception had finally come to pass. And the worst part was knowing that somewhere in the Empire, Clarissa was still out there, still in danger, still running, still trying to warn her sister about threats that had already arrived and destroyed everything. The guards escorted them into the castle and to their separate wings, making it clear that even here they were prisoners. not masters. Evelyn climbed the tower stairs to her rooms alone and locked the door behind her with shaking hands. She walked to the window and looked out over the city where 10,000 lights burned against the darkness. Somewhere down there were enemies she couldn't see, conspirators she couldn't identify, people who wanted her dead badly enough to commit murder in front of the entire imperial court. And tomorrow the investigation would begin. Questions she couldn't answer, evidence she couldn't refute. A web of lies and truth so tangled that she couldn't even be certain what was real anymore. Evelyn pressed her forehead against the cold glass and tried to find some reserve of strength to face what was coming. But all she felt was exhaustion and terror, and the absolute certainty that the woman she'd been when she arrived at this castle, quiet, overlooked, trying desperately to be good, that woman couldn't survive what came next. To live through this, she'd have to become something else entirely. Something harder, something colder, something willing to do whatever was necessary to protect the fragile truth she and Lucien had built from the ashes of their arrangement, even if it meant embracing the very darkness she'd spent her whole life trying to avoid. The storm was here, and there was nowhere left to run. The investigation began at dawn. Evelyn woke to the sound of Imperial guards searching her rooms, methodical and invasive, pulling books from shelves and emptying drawers with the efficient brutality of men following orders. She sat on the edge of her bed in her nightgown and watched them dismantle her carefully constructed life piece by piece, looking for evidence that would condemn her for a murder she hadn't committed. The lead investigator was a man named Captain Hendrik Voss, gray-haired and stone-faced, with eyes that had seen enough violence to be immune to shock. He stood in the doorway supervising the search, while Evelyn's maid cowered in the corner, too terrified to even offer her mistress a robe. "Your Grace," Captain Voss said, and the title sounded like an accusation. "You'll need to answer some questions about your whereabouts last night. I was at the state dinner with my husband, surrounded by 300 witnesses. Not the entire evening." His voice was flat, emotionless. "You and the Grand Duke disappeared into the Rose Garden for approximately 20 minutes. What were you doing there?" Evelyn met his eyes and chose her words with surgical care. "Having a private conversation, away from the crowd." "About what?" "Personal matters. Between a husband and wife." The captain's expression didn't change, but she saw his mind cataloging that evasion as suspicious. "Did you speak with Minister Moreau at any point during the evening?" "Briefly. During the reception before dinner. My husband was present for the entire exchange." "And what was discussed?" "Standard court pleasantries. Nothing of substance." "Minister Moreau was found with a note claiming you're not Clarissa Hartwell, but her younger sister." The captain pulled out a copy of the blood-stained paper and held it where she could see. "Is that true?" The question hung in the air like a blade. Evelyn's heart hammered against her ribs, but she kept her expression neutral, kept her voice steady. She'd spent 6 weeks learning to lie under pressure. This was just another test. "That's absurd. I am Clarissa Hartwell, Grand Duchess of Valmont. Anyone claiming otherwise is either mistaken or deliberately spreading malicious rumors. So you deny the allegation completely?" "Completely." The captain studied her for a long moment, and Evelyn stared back, refusing to flinch, refusing to show the terror clawing at her insides. Finally, he folded the paper and tucked it away. "We'll need to verify your identity through official records, birth certificates, family documentation, testimony from people who knew you before the marriage." "Of course. Whatever's necessary to clear my name." It was a gamble, and they both knew it. The Hartwell family records had been carefully altered before the wedding. Lucian's doing, she realized now, covering tracks she hadn't even known needed covering. But there were still servants who'd known both sisters, still people in society who might remember discrepancies. The search continued for another hour before Captain Voss finally called his men off. They left with boxes of her correspondence and personal effects, evidence that would be analyzed for anything incriminating. Evelyn sat alone in her ransacked rooms and tried to calculate how long she had before the lies unraveled completely. A knock at the door. Mrs. Thornberry entered without waiting for permission, her face set in grim lines. "His Grace wants to see you." "In his study. The guards have agreed to allow it under supervision." Evelyn dressed quickly in the plainest gown she owned and followed the housekeeper through corridors lined with imperial soldiers. The castle that had been her prison now felt like a tomb, every door guarded, every window watched, escape impossible, even if she'd been foolish enough to try. Lucien's study was in the West Wing, a room she'd never entered before. It was austere like everything else about him, walls lined with maps and military texts, a desk covered in correspondence, windows overlooking the northern mountains. 2 guards flanked the doorway, and a third stood inside, making it clear this meeting would have no privacy. Lucien stood at the window with his back to the door. When he turned to face her, Evelyn's breath caught. He looked like he hadn't slept, dark shadows under his eyes and tension radiating from every line of his body. But his expression when he saw her was pure relief. "Are you hurt? Did they—" "I'm fine." She crossed the room quickly, and his arms came around her before she could say anything else. The guard by the door cleared his throat in warning, but neither of them acknowledged it. Lucien held her like she was something precious and fragile, and Evelyn buried her face in his chest and tried not to fall apart. "We don't have much time," he murmured against her hair. "They're searching my rooms next, and I need you to understand what's happening. Someone framed me for murder. Not just you. Both of us." His voice was grim. "Whoever killed Moreau wants us both destroyed. The investigation is a formality. The Emperor has already decided we're guilty. He's just waiting for enough evidence to make the arrest look legitimate." Evelyn pulled back to look at his face. "Why would the Emperor want us destroyed?" "Because I have too much military power and not enough political loyalty. Because this gives him the perfect excuse to seize Valmont lands and redistribute them to nobles who'll support him without question. Because we're convenient scapegoats for a murder that probably has nothing to do with us at all." The casual brutality of it stole her breath. This was imperial politics at its most ruthless. Lives destroyed not because of actual guilt, but because their destruction served someone's strategic interests. She'd known the court was dangerous, but this was something else entirely. This was systematic annihilation dressed up as justice. "What do we do?" "We find who actually killed Moreau, and we expose them before the Emperor can move against us officially." Lucien's jaw tightened. "I've sent word to my military commanders. If this goes badly, they're prepared to move troops to the capital. That's treason. That's survival." His eyes met hers with absolute conviction. "I will burn this empire to ash before I let them execute you for a crime you didn't commit." The words should have terrified her, but instead they felt like a lifeline. Lucien Valmont had spent a decade building his power through careful strategy and political calculation. Now he was ready to throw all of it away in open rebellion if that's what keeping her alive required. The man who'd treated her like furniture 2 months ago was now prepared to start a civil war rather than lose her. People didn't change that completely, which meant he'd never been as cold as he pretended. He'd just been waiting for something worth fighting for. "I need you to tell me everything you remember about last night," he said. "Every person who seemed too interested in you, every conversation that felt strange. Everything." So Evelyn walked through the evening in painful detail while Lucien listened with focused intensity, occasionally asking sharp questions that pulled out details she hadn't realized were significant. When she got to the part about Thomas Brennan in the garden, his expression went absolutely murderous. He was a distraction. Someone wanted us occupied while they killed Moreau and planted that note. But who? And why frame me specifically instead of just destroying you directly? Because you're the weak point. Lucien started pacing, his mind clearly racing through possibilities. "I have too much military support to attack openly, but if they can prove the Grand Duchess is a fraud, that our marriage is invalid, that creates grounds to strip me of titles and lands, it delegitimizes everything I've built." The guard by the door shifted uncomfortably. "Your Grace, the captain said you have 10 minutes. It's been 12. We need more time. You need to follow the Emperor's orders." The guard's hand moved to his sword. "Both of you. Unless you want this situation to escalate." Lucy looked like he wanted to argue, but Evelyn touched his arm, stopping him. Starting a fight with the guards wouldn't help anything and might give the Emperor exactly the excuse he needed to arrest them immediately. "I'll be fine," she said quietly. "Just find the truth before they manufacture enough lies to bury us." His hand came up to cup her face with surprising gentleness. "I'm not losing you. Whatever it takes." Then he kissed her hard enough to make the guard look away in embarrassment, and Evelyn kissed him back with the desperate intensity of someone who knew this might be the last time. When they finally broke apart, her lips were bruised and her heart was breaking. The guard escorted her back to her rooms and locked her in. Evelyn stood at the window watching dawn light spread across the city and tried to think like Lucien had taught her. Who benefited from their destruction? Who had the resources to orchestrate a murder in the middle of the imperial palace? Who knew about the substitution and how to weaponize it? The answer came to her with sickening clarity. Someone inside the imperial court. Someone close enough to the emperor to move freely through the palace. Someone who'd been present at the dinner and had access to Minister Moreau. Someone who'd smiled at her across the ballroom while planning her execution. She was still working through the implications when Mrs. Thornberry arrived with breakfast and news that made Evelyn's blood run cold. "They found your sister," the housekeeper said quietly. "Clarissa. She's been arrested trying to enter the capital. They're bringing her here within the hour." Everything stopped. Evelyn stared at Mrs. Thornberry while her mind struggled to process what that meant. Clarissa was alive. Clarissa was coming here. Clarissa would stand in front of imperial investigators and confirm that yes, the woman claiming to be her was actually her younger sister, that the entire marriage was built on fraud. It was over. All of it. The deception she'd maintained for 2 months would collapse the moment Clarissa walked through the door. Unless Evelyn could find a way to stop it. She spent the next 40 minutes in frantic planning. Could she convince Clarissa to lie? To maintain the deception even under imperial interrogation? It seemed impossible. Clarissa had run away to avoid this marriage in the first place. Why would she suddenly agree to participate in the fraud? Because lives depend on it now, Evelyn thought desperately. Not just mine. Lucian's. Our entire family's. But would that be enough? The sound of horses in the courtyard below made her rush to the window. Imperial guards on horseback surrounding a prisoner transport, and climbing down from the carriage, hands bound in iron manacles, was Clarissa. Even from 3 stories up, Evelyn could see how much her sister had changed. Clarissa had always been beautiful in an almost theatrical way, tall and striking with perfect posture and the kind of confidence that drew every eye in a room. The woman the guards dragged from that carriage was thinner, harder, with wild eyes and tangled hair. She looked like she'd been running for months. She looked terrified. Their eyes met across the courtyard, and Evelyn saw recognition and guilt and something else flash across Clarissa's face. Regret, maybe, or resignation. Then the guards hauled her inside, and she was gone. Evelyn paced her rooms like a caged animal. Any minute now, the investigators would bring Clarissa to identify the woman claiming to be her. Any minute, the truth would come out, and everything would collapse. She needed to talk to her sister first, needed to explain and convince, and somehow make her understand. The door flew open. Not guards this time. Lucien, breathing hard like he'd run the entire length of the castle. "They have your sister." His voice was rough. "She'll be questioned within the hour." "I know." Evelyn's hands were shaking. "Lucien, when she tells them the truth, she's not going to tell them anything." "What?" He crossed the room and gripped her shoulders. "I spoke with her, just now, before the guards could isolate her. That's impossible. They would never allow—" "I didn't ask permission." His smile was sharp and dangerous. "I told you I'd do whatever was necessary. That includes breaking imperial protocols." "What did she say?" "She told me everything. About why she ran, about what she discovered." Evelyn's heart stopped. "Tell me." Lucien pulled her to the window where they'd have at least the illusion of privacy and pitched his voice low enough that only she could hear. 3 months ago, your sister was approached by someone in the imperial court. They wanted to recruit her as an informant, to spy on me after the marriage, to report on my military activities and political alliances. When she refused, they threatened your family, said they'd expose your father's debts and have him arrested unless she cooperated. That's why she ran. That's why she tried to run. But before she could leave the capital, she witnessed something she wasn't supposed to see. A meeting between Minister Moreau and a group of nobles. They were planning a coup. Against the emperor? Against me. Lucian's expression was carved from granite. They wanted to use evidence of marriage fraud to strip me of my titles and lands, then move against my military commanders before they could organize resistance. Moreau was coordinating the whole thing. Then who killed him? Someone who wanted the coup to fail, but needed us to take the blame. Lucian's eyes were cold with understanding. Someone who benefits from both the conspirators being eliminated and us being destroyed in the process. The Emperor. The Emperor. The pieces fell into place with terrible clarity. The entire evening had been orchestrated, luring them to the palace, separating them in the garden, murdering Moreau, and framing them for it. The investigation wasn't meant to find the truth. It was meant to provide legal cover for destroying the two biggest threats to imperial power: Lucien with his military strength, and the conspirators who'd been foolish enough to plot openly. "Everyone loses except the Emperor," Evelyn whispered, "which means we can't win by proving our innocence. We can only survive by changing the game entirely." "How?" Lucien pulled something from inside his coat. The papers Thomas Brennan had tried to use for blackmail, now covered in Lucien's handwriting, notes and connections, and a web of conspiracy laid out in brutal detail. "We go public, expose everything: the coup plot, the murder, the Emperor's involvement. We force the imperial court to choose sides, and we make damn sure they choose ours. That's suicide. The moment you accuse the Emperor of murder, I have 3,000 troops within a day's march of the capital. The Emperor has maybe 1,500 palace guards and whatever city garrison he can rally. If this turns into open conflict, I will win. And how many thousands die in the process?" The question hung between them, and Evelyn saw the weight of it settle on Lucien's shoulders. This was the calculation he'd been running since the moment they'd been placed under house arrest. How many lives was their survival worth? How much blood could he justify spilling to protect one woman who'd walked into his life by accident? She watched him wrestle with it and saw the moment he made his choice, saw something fundamental shift in his expression from strategic calculation to absolute conviction. "None," he said quietly, "if I can help it." "Which is why we're not starting a war." "Then what are we doing? We're giving the Emperor a way out, a political solution that lets him save face while we survive." Evelyn stared at him. "What kind of solution?" Lucien's smile was sharp enough to cut. "We proved Clarissa was the target all along, that she uncovered the coup and went into hiding, that Minister Moreau was killed by his own co-conspirators to silence him, that the note claiming you're not Clarissa was planted by the conspirators to discredit us and prevent us from exposing them. But that's a lie." "Yes, built on the foundation of our original lie." He gripped her hands. "But it's a lie the Emperor can accept. It lets him execute the surviving conspirators as traitors, consolidates his power, and keeps me loyal because he spared my wife. Everyone wins, except the truth. The truth doesn't matter in imperial politics. Only power and survival." He was right, and Evelyn knew it. This was the world they lived in, built on carefully constructed fictions and strategic deceptions. Fighting it would get them killed. The only way through was to build a better lie and sell it hard enough that people chose to believe it. "What about Clarissa? She'll have to—" "She's already agreed." Lucien's expression softened slightly. "Your sister is terrified and exhausted and desperate to make amends for abandoning you. She'll testify to whatever we need her to say. And when this is over, when we've survived this and the Emperor's moved on to his next crisis, what happens to her? We protect her. Give her enough money to disappear properly this time. Set her up somewhere far from the capital where she can build a life that doesn't involve imperial conspiracies. You've thought of everything. I've had a very motivated few hours." He touched her face gently. "I told you, I'm not losing you." The door crashed open. Captain Voss with a contingent of guards, their expressions grim. "Grand Duke Valmont, you're in violation of house arrest terms. Return to your quarters immediately." "In a moment." Lucien didn't even look at him. "Now, Your Grace, or I'll have my men remove you by force." Lucien turned slowly and the temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. "You're welcome to try, Captain, but I should warn you that attempting to physically restrain me tends to end poorly for the people involved." The guards' hands moved to their weapons, but Voss held up a hand, stopping them. This was a man who'd survived decades of court politics by knowing when to push and when to retreat. 2 minutes, he said. "Then I'm coming back with twice as many men." He withdrew and Lucien turned back to Evelyn. "Tonight," he said urgently, "during the formal interrogation, Clarissa will testify that she went into hiding after discovering the coup. You'll confirm her story and present this evidence." His hand pressed the papers into hers. "I've documented everything: meeting dates, participating nobles, financial transfers. It's enough to hang 20 conspirators and make the Emperor look competent for rooting them out. And if he doesn't accept the narrative, if he decides we're still too dangerous to let live, Then tomorrow morning my troops enter the capital, and we find out if I'm as good a general as my reputation suggests." His eyes were hard as Arctic ice. "But it won't come to that. The Emperor is a politician before he's anything else. He'll take the win I'm offering him." Evelyn looked at the papers in her hands. A masterwork of strategic lying, built on fragments of truth and desperation. This was who they'd become. Not the cold aristocrat and overlooked daughter who'd married by accident, but partners in survival, willing to construct whatever reality necessary to protect each other. "What if something goes wrong?" she asked quietly. "Then we die together instead of alone. Is that acceptable?" Evelyn thought about the girl she'd been 8 weeks ago, terrified and desperate, walking into a marriage she didn't want to save a family that barely noticed her. That girl would have been horrified by what she'd become, by the lies she'd told and the deceptions she'd maintained and the ruthless calculation she'd learned to wield like a weapon. But that girl wouldn't have survived this world, wouldn't have been strong enough or cold enough or desperate enough to do what survival required. Sometimes you had to become someone else entirely, just to stay alive. Sometimes the price of love was losing every soft part of yourself and replacing it with steel. Sometimes being worthy of protection meant becoming dangerous enough to fight alongside the person protecting you. Evelyn looked at Lucien and saw her own transformation reflected in his eyes. Two people who'd started as strangers, forced together by politics, who'd somehow found each other in the wreckage and decided that what they'd built was worth burning the empire down to defend. "It's acceptable," she said. He kissed her hard and fast, then pulled back. "Trust me. Trust Clarissa. And whatever happens in that interrogation room, don't break character. You're the Grand Duchess. You've never been anyone else. Hold that truth, and everything else will follow." Then the guards returned and hauled him bodily from the room. Evelyn watched them drag him away and felt something settle in her chest that might have been courage or might have been madness. Maybe there wasn't much difference when you'd been backed into a corner with nowhere left to run. She spent the next 6 hours preparing, memorizing Lucian's documentation, rehearsing her testimony, building the facade of Clarissa Hartwell so thoroughly that she almost believed it herself. Mrs. Thornberry brought food she couldn't eat and wine she drained too quickly, and through it all the housekeeper said nothing but her presence felt like silent support. When the summons finally came, it was full dark outside. Captain Voss himself escorted her through the castle to what had once been the grand ballroom and was now an improvised interrogation chamber. Chairs arranged in a semicircle facing a single seat in the center. Imperial investigators seated like judges. The Emperor himself in a throne-like chair at the apex, watching her approach with the cold interest of a man observing an experiment. Evelyn walked to the center seat with her head high and her hands steady. She'd survived everything else. She'd survived this too. Clarissa was already there, seated off to the side with guards flanking her. Their eyes met, and Evelyn saw her sister's fear and guilt and desperate hope, saw the unspoken question. "Can we actually pull this off?" Evelyn gave the barest nod. "We have to." The interrogation began with brutal efficiency. Questions fired from multiple investigators designed to catch inconsistencies and trap her in lies. "When did you discover the coup plot? Who told you about Minister Moreau's involvement? Why didn't you report this to imperial authorities immediately?" Evelyn answered each one with the story they'd constructed, weaving truth and fiction so seamlessly that she almost lost track of which was which. Yes, her sister had uncovered a conspiracy. Yes, they'd been terrified of retaliation. Yes, the murder was clearly an attempt by the conspirators to silence anyone who knew the truth. The Emperor watched it all without expression, giving nothing away. When it was Clarissa's turn, her sister delivered the performance of her life. Tearful and dramatic and utterly convincing, describing meetings she'd witnessed and documents she'd stolen and the terror that had driven her into hiding. She confirmed every detail of Evelyn's testimony and added flourishes that made the conspiracy feel even more dangerous. The investigators conferred in low voices. Captain Voss produced evidence that corroborated parts of the story. Financial records that showed suspicious transfers between the named conspirators, correspondence that suggested coordination. It was damning and comprehensive, and Evelyn realized with shock that Lucien must have been building this case for weeks, long before tonight's crisis. He'd seen the conspiracy forming and had been quietly documenting it, waiting for the right moment to deploy the evidence. That moment was now. The Emperor rose and the room fell silent. He walked slowly around Evelyn's chair, studying her the way a jeweler might study a flawed diamond, deciding whether it was worth salvaging or should be thrown away as worthless. "You're asking me to believe," he said quietly, "that a young woman with no political experience uncovered a conspiracy that my own Minister of Internal Security missed, that she went into hiding rather than seek imperial protection, that the murder of said minister was not connected to accusations of marriage fraud, but was instead committed by his own allies. Does that about summarize your testimony?" Evelyn met his eyes and saw the calculation there. He knew the official story was constructed, knew they were lying, but he was weighing whether accepting the lie served his interests better than exposing it. "Yes, Your Majesty. That summarizes it accurately, and you expect me to simply accept this convenient narrative without question. I expect you to examine the evidence, evaluate the testimony, and reach the conclusion that serves the Empire best. Whatever that conclusion might be." It was a gamble, putting the choice back on him, framing it as his decision rather than theirs. The Emperor's eyes narrowed slightly, and Evelyn saw him recognize the trap. If he rejected their story now, he'd have to explain why he was protecting conspirators. If he accepted it, he consolidated power and eliminated threats while keeping Lucian's military support. The political calculation was obvious. The only question was whether his pride would let him take the win. The silence stretched so long Evelyn's heart started hammering against her ribs. This was it. The moment when survival or execution would be decided by imperial whim. Finally, the Emperor turned to Captain Voss. "Arrest every noble named in this documentation. Charge them with conspiracy to commit treason. Have them in the imperial dungeons by dawn." The room erupted in motion, guards moving out, investigators scrambling to process the order. The Emperor turned back to Evelyn, and his expression was unreadable. "As for you, Grand Duchess, you and your sister have performed a great service to the Empire by exposing this conspiracy. Your house arrest is lifted effective immediately. You're free to return to your normal duties." He said it loud enough for everyone to hear. Official exoneration, public vindication. The lie transformed into truth by imperial decree. Evelyn rose and curtsied low. "Thank you, Your Majesty. Your justice is a gift to all loyal subjects." The words tasted like ash, but she delivered them with perfect sincerity. This was the price of survival, performing gratitude to a man who'd tried to destroy her, pretending the entire nightmare had been his generosity rather than his conspiracy. The Emperor smiled without warmth. "See that you remain loyal, Grand Duchess. I would hate for such a valuable ally to become a problem in the future." The threat was clear. Step out of line and this reprieve evaporates. Evelyn nodded her understanding and backed out of the chamber with Clarissa at her side. The moment they were clear of the ballroom, her sister grabbed her arm. "I'm so sorry," Clarissa whispered. "For all of it. For running, for leaving you to face this alone, for we survived. That's what matters." They found Lucien in the corridor outside his study, surrounded by guards who looked uncertain whether to keep restraining him now that the Emperor had lifted the house arrest. The moment he saw Evelyn, his expression shifted from lethal focus to raw relief. He crossed the space between them in 3 strides and pulled her into his arms hard enough to lift her off her feet. For a long moment, they just held each other while Clarissa looked away and the guards pretended to be very interested in the ceiling. When Lucien finally set her down, his hands came up to frame her face. "Is it over?" "For now." Evelyn's voice shook slightly. "The Emperor accepted our story. The conspirators are being arrested. Then we won. We survived. That's not the same as winning. Close enough." He kissed her forehead, her cheeks, her lips. Close enough. The guards dispersed and the 3 of them stood alone in the corridor, Evelyn and Lucien and the sister who'd started this entire cascade of disasters. Clarissa looked between them and something like understanding crossed her face. "You love her," she said to Lucien. "Actually love her. Not just protecting an asset." He didn't take his eyes off Evelyn. "Yes, and you love him," Clarissa said to her sister. Evelyn thought about denying it, about maintaining some final protective distance. But she was so tired of lying, and this at least was truth. "Yes." Clarissa smiled, sad and genuine and maybe a little envious. "Then I'm glad my disaster of a life gave you both something real." The next morning, carriages arrived to take Clarissa north to a property Lucien owned near the coast. Far from the capital, well-funded, safe. The sisters said goodbye in the castle courtyard while dawn light turned the stones gold. "Thank you," Clarissa whispered, "for saving everyone, including me. Thank you for coming back, for testifying. I owed you that much. And more." Clarissa pulled back and there were tears on her face. "Be happy, Evie. You deserve it after everything." Then she climbed into the carriage and was gone, rolling away toward a future that didn't include imperial conspiracies or forced marriages or any of the disasters she'd fled from. Evelyn watched until the carriage disappeared beyond the gates and felt something settle in her chest. This was her life now. Not the one she'd planned, not the one she'd wanted, but the one she'd fought for and survived and somehow transformed into something worth keeping. Lucien came to stand beside her and his hand found hers. Any regrets? Evelyn thought about it. About the girl she'd been and the woman she'd become. About the lies she'd told and the truths she'd discovered. About the cold aristocrat who'd treated her like furniture and the man who'd been willing to burn an empire down rather than lose her. "None," she said finally. "You? Only that I didn't see you clearly from the beginning. That I wasted so much time treating you like an inconvenience when you were the best thing that ever walked into my life." The words were so unlike him, vulnerable and honest and completely unguarded, that Evelyn's throat tightened. "We have time now," she said. "All the time we need." They stood together watching the sun rise over Aranthia, and Evelyn let herself believe it, that the worst was over, that they'd survived and could finally build something stable on the foundation of all they'd endured. She should have known better. The attack came 3 days later, just after midnight, when the castle was quiet and the guards were rotating shifts. Evelyn woke to the sound of steel on steel and screaming in the corridors below. She scrambled out of bed, reaching for anything that could serve as a weapon, and found Lucien already in her room, fully dressed with a sword in his hand. "Get dressed. Now. We have maybe 2 minutes. What's happening?" "The conspirators we thought were arrested. Some of them weren't. And they're here." Evelyn's blood went ice cold. She threw on the first clothes she could find while Lucien barricaded the door. The sounds of fighting were getting closer, men shouting, metal clashing, something heavy crashing through glass. "How many? Too many. And they're not trying to capture us. They're trying to kill us." The door shuddered under a massive impact. Lucien grabbed her hand and hauled her toward the window. "The connecting passage. The one between our wings. Can you make it across the roof?" Evelyn looked out at the narrow stone ledge connecting the east and west towers, 3 stories above the courtyard with nothing but darkness below. Every instinct screamed that stepping onto that ledge meant death. But staying here meant death more certainly. The door splintered. Armed men poured through and Lucien put himself between them and Evelyn without hesitation. His sword moved with brutal efficiency, and 2 attackers went down in seconds, but there were more behind them, and Evelyn knew with sick certainty that even Lucien Valmont couldn't fight a dozen men at once. "Go!" he shouted. "I'll hold them, not without you. Then we go together." He killed another man and grabbed her hand, and they ran for the window. Lucien went first, sword still in hand, balancing on the stone ledge with the kind of precision that came from years of battlefield experience. Evelyn followed, and the wind hit her like a physical force, cold and vicious, threatening to tear her from the wall. "Don't look down," Lucien said. "Eyes on me. Just follow." She did. Focused everything on his back, on moving 1 foot in front of the other on stone slick with rain. Behind them, the attackers reached the window and someone fired a crossbow. The bolt whistled past Evelyn's head close enough that she felt the wind of its passage. Lucien reached the west tower window and smashed through it with his elbow. Glass exploded inward, and he hauled Evelyn through after him. They landed in his study and he was already moving, grabbing documents and weapons, and things she couldn't identify in the darkness. "We need to reach the stables," he said. "Get horses," and the study door exploded inward and suddenly they were surrounded. 8 men in dark clothing with weapons drawn and faces hidden behind masks. Professional killers, the kind who didn't fail assignments. The leader stepped forward and pulled off his mask. Evelyn's world stopped. It was Captain Voss, the Imperial investigator. The man who was supposed to be hunting the conspirators was standing in Lucien's study with a blade in his hand and murder in his eyes. "Nothing personal, Your Graces," he said calmly, "but the Emperor changed his mind about letting you live. Turns out having a Grand Duke with military power and a Duchess who knows too many secrets is more risk than reward. You're lying, Lucian said flatly. The Emperor gave his word. The Emperor is a politician. His word lasts exactly as long as it's convenient. He gestured, and his men began closing in. You should have taken your victory and disappeared while you had the chance. There was nowhere to go. No window to escape through, no passage to run down. Just 8 trained killers and 2 people who'd survived everything else only to have their own emperor order their execution. Evelyn felt Lucian's hand tighten on hers and knew he was calculating the same impossible odds. I love you, he said quietly. I love you too. Then Lucien Valmont smiled, sharp and vicious and completely unafraid, and raised his sword. And somewhere in the castle below, the real battle for the Empire's future began. The first man died before he finished raising his sword. Lucien moved with the brutal efficiency of someone who'd spent a decade turning combat into an art form, blades sliding between ribs with surgical precision, pulling free in time to deflect the next attack. Blood sprayed across expensive carpets, and the study filled with the smell of copper and death. Evelyn grabbed a letter opener from the desk because standing there defenseless while 8 trained killers tried to murder them. Both felt like surrender, and she'd come too far to surrender now. The blade was laughably inadequate. Ornamental silver meant for opening correspondence, not fighting for survival, but it was something sharp, and she held it like her life depended on it because it did. Captain Voss hung back while his men attacked, watching with the cold calculation of a commander assessing battlefield tactics. Lucien cut through 2 more assassins, but there were still 5 left, and even he couldn't hold that kind of numerical disadvantage forever. Blood ran down his left arm from a gash Evelyn hadn't seen him take, and his breathing was coming harder. She saw the moment the balance shifted, saw exhaustion starting to slow his movements just enough that the next blade would get through his defenses, saw death approaching with mathematical certainty. So she did the only thing desperation allowed. She threw herself at the nearest assassin with her letter opener raised and absolutely no idea what she was doing beyond creating enough chaos to buy Lucien another few seconds. The assassin turned toward her in surprise, and that hesitation cost him his life. Lucien's blade took him through the throat and he went down gurgling. But now there were 2 men between Lucien and Evelyn, cutting them off from each other, and Captain Voss was moving forward with his sword drawn and a smile that promised nothing good. You should have stayed quiet and accepted your exile, he said conversationally, circling toward Evelyn. The Emperor was willing to let you disappear. But you had to expose the conspiracy, had to make yourself too dangerous to ignore. We exposed traitors, Evelyn said, backing away and trying to keep the desk between them. That was supposed to earn gratitude, not assassination. Gratitude in politics is just deferred revenge. You cost the Emperor valuable allies, made him look weak for not catching the conspiracy himself. That kind of embarrassment requires blood to wash away. Then you're killing us to salvage his pride. I'm killing you because it's profitable. The Emperor pays well for problems that disappear permanently. Across the room, Lucien had cut down another assassin but taken a blade to his side in the process. He was still fighting, but Evelyn could see him slowing, could see blood spreading across his shirt in a stain too large to survive. The realization hit her like ice water. They were going to die here, both of them. Murdered in his own castle by men following imperial orders. All the survival and strategy and desperate fighting would end here in pools of blood on expensive carpet, while the Emperor rewrote history to make them the villains. Unless she could change the equation. Evelyn's hand closed on something heavy on the desk behind her. A bronze statue of some martial figure, solid and weighted perfectly for throwing. She didn't let herself think about aim or probability or the 1,000 ways this could go wrong. She just hurled it at Captain Voss's head with every ounce of strength desperation could summon. It caught him across the temple with a crack that echoed through the study. He stumbled sideways, dazed, and Evelyn ran. Not toward Lucien, he was surrounded, and she'd just get them both killed trying to reach him. Toward the door, toward the corridor beyond where there had to be guards or servants or someone who could stop this massacre. She made it 3 steps before someone grabbed her hair and yanked her backward hard enough to make her vision white out. Hit the floor on her back with impact that drove the air from her lungs. Looked up to see an assassin standing over her with his blade raised for a killing stroke. Time slowed. She saw the sword starting to descend. Saw her death written in the trajectory of that falling blade. Saw Lucien across the room screaming her name through a throat gone raw. The door exploded inward. Not guards, not servants. An entire platoon of soldiers in Valmont colors led by a man Evelyn recognized from portraits in the castle halls. Commander Marcus Thorne, Lucian's second in command, face twisted with rage as he took in the scene. "Kill them all!" he roared. The study descended into absolute chaos, Valmont soldiers pouring through the door to clash with the remaining assassins. Steel on steel and shouting and the wet sounds of men dying. The blade that should have killed Evelyn was deflected by a soldier's shield, and suddenly someone was pulling her to her feet and moving her toward the door. She fought them, twisted in their grip, and screamed Lucian's name because she couldn't see him through the press of bodies, and if he was dead while she escaped, she'd never forgive herself for surviving. Then the crowd parted, and there he was, still standing, still alive, covered in blood, his own and others', but breathing and conscious and already moving toward her with the single-minded focus of a man who'd walked through literal hell to reach safety. Their hands found each other and held on like drowning people clutching driftwood. The fighting lasted another brutal minute before the last assassin went down. Captain Voss tried to run, but Commander Thorne caught him at the door and drove a blade through his spine with enough force to pin him to the doorframe. The captain died without ceremony, just a final gurgle and the slow collapse of a body that had betrayed everything it was sworn to protect. Evelyn stood in the wreckage of Lucian's study and tried to process that they'd survived. Again, against odds that should have been impossible. She looked at Commander Thorne and saw him kneeling before Lucian with something like worship in his eyes. "Your Grace, I received your message about the Emperor's betrayal. I brought every man within an hour's ride. Are you—" "I'm alive." Lucian's voice was rough with pain and exhaustion. "Thanks to you." "How did you know to come to the study specifically?" One of the maids saw armed men entering through the servants' passages. "She ran to find us. Probably saved your lives. Probably saved the entire empire." Lucian swayed slightly and Evelyn grabbed his arm to steady him. The wound in his side was still bleeding freely, and his face had gone gray. "We need a surgeon, now." They carried him to his chambers while soldiers secured the castle and rounded up any remaining assassins. Evelyn stayed at his side while the castle's physician cleaned and stitched the worst of the wounds with practiced efficiency. The gash in his side was deep, but had missed vital organs by fingers. The cut on his arm was mostly superficial. He'd survive, had survived, but it had been close enough to leave her hands shaking. When the physician finally left them alone, Lucian grabbed her wrist with blood-stained fingers. "You threw a statue at a trained killer's head. It was heavy bronze. Seemed like a waste not to use it. You could have been killed. I was about to be killed anyway. At least this way I went down fighting." He pulled her down onto the bed beside him and wrapped his arms around her despite the physician's orders to stay still. They lay there in the darkness while dawn light started filtering through the windows, and the sounds of soldiers moving through the castle provided a strangely comforting backdrop. "The Emperor sent assassins," Evelyn said quietly, "even after we gave him everything he wanted, even after we saved his throne from conspirators. Because we know too much, because we're too powerful, because he's a politician, and politicians don't let potential threats survive no matter what promises they make." Lucian's voice was bitter with understanding. "I should have seen it coming. What do we do now? Now we stop playing defense and start taking ground." Evelyn pulled back to look at his face. "You're talking about war. I'm talking about survival. The Emperor just declared war on us by sending those assassins. We can either wait for him to try again, or we can force a conclusion on our terms. That conclusion ends with the Empire in flames. That conclusion ends with us alive and the Emperor realizing that destroying us costs more than tolerating us." Lucian's eyes were hard. "I have 5,000 troops loyal to me personally. The Emperor has maybe 3,000 palace guards and scattered garrisons. If I march on the capital, he can't stop me. And how many civilians die when you besiege the city?" The question stopped him. Evelyn watched the calculation run behind his eyes. Tactical advantage weighed against human cost, victory measured in lives destroyed. This was the edge she'd seen him walk since the moment they'd met. The line between strategic brilliance and ruthless brutality. Between protecting what mattered and becoming the monster everyone already believed him to be. She touched his face gently and felt him lean into her palm like a man starving for human contact. "There has to be another way," she said. "Some option between rolling over and burning the Empire down. If there is, I haven't found it yet. Then we find it together. They spent the next 3 days planning. Commander Thorne brought reports of troop movements and political alliances. Mrs. Thornberry provided intelligence from servants connected to noble households throughout the capital. Slowly, a picture emerged of an empire teetering on the edge. Nobles choosing sides, military commanders calculating advantages, civilians terrified of being caught in the crossfire between the Emperor and the Grand Duke, who'd become too powerful to control. Evelyn pored over every scrap of information looking for leverage that didn't require mass bloodshed. She studied the Emperor's political network and found cracks: nobles who owed him loyalty but resented his authority, commanders who'd follow orders but lacked genuine conviction, advisors who valued stability more than any individual ruler. The Emperor's power rested on the perception that he was indispensable, that removing him would create chaos worse than tolerating his rule. If they could shatter that perception without actually killing him, they might survive this without civil war.